The cold, sterile air in the prison cell felt suffocating. Jack Harris sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his thick, dark hair. His mind was a swirl of confusion, regret, and disbelief. How had he ended up here? In this place, this cold cell, waiting for a fate that seemed inevitable. He stared at the walls around him, gray, unyielding. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one bringing him closer to the end. But there was one thing he had to do, something that might be his only chance at redemption, at peace. Do you ever wonder what happens when everything you know, everything you love, is taken from you in an instant? Jack's voice echoed softly in the silence of the room. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, not even to himself. It was just a thought, a fleeting question that had been on his mind for weeks now. The door to his cell creaked open, and a guard stepped inside. His name was Officer Daniels, a tall, imposing figure whose face Jack had come to recognize over the months of his imprisonment. Daniels was no stranger to this place. He had seen countless people come and go, most of them without a second thought. But something about Jack had always seemed different. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, haunted, but not defeated. "What do you need, Harris?" Daniels asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Jack stood up slowly, his body aching from the confinement, the lack of movement. He cleared his throat before speaking, his words coming out quieter than usual, as if he were unsure of how to ask for what he truly wanted. "I want to see him," Jack said. "See who?" Daniels replied, clearly not understanding. "My dog," Jack clarified, his voice barely above a whisper. "Max. I want to see Max." For a moment, there was silence. Officer Daniels stood still, his hand hovering over the door handle. He knew the rules, just as well as Jack did. Prisoners didn't get last requests unless they were facing execution. And even then, those requests were usually mundane, letters, personal items, a final meal. But this was different. This wasn't a typical request. This wasn't just for some material comfort. It was for something much more profound. Something that had been Jack's companion, his only true friend, throughout the darkest years of his life. "I can't do that, Harris," Daniels finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. "It's against protocol. You know the rules." Jack's heart sank. He had expected this answer, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. Max, his loyal golden retriever, had been by his side for years. Through the good times and the bad, Max had never left him. Even when the world had turned its back on Jack, Max had stayed. The dog had been there through the trials, through the late-night drives when Jack just needed someone to talk to, through the quiet mornings when all Jack wanted was to feel like he wasn't alone. "I'm begging you," Jack said, his voice breaking slightly. "Please. I just need to see him one last time. I can't go out of here without saying goodbye to him." The guard hesitated, clearly torn. He wasn't supposed to allow prisoners to see anyone outside the facility, especially not an animal. But there was something about Jack's plea, something raw and genuine, that made Daniels pause. He had heard rumors about Jack's case. A man wrongly accused, a family torn apart. Maybe, just maybe, Jack deserved this small comfort. "I'll have to talk to the warden," Daniels said reluctantly. "But don't get your hopes up." Jack nodded, a sense of relief washing over him, though he knew it was a slim chance. Still, it was a chance. And that was all he needed. As the hours passed, Jack sat back down on his cot, his thoughts racing. He had been sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. It had been a rushed trial, filled with mistakes, omissions, and questionable evidence. He had tried everything, appeals, legal arguments, even public protests, but it all seemed so futile. Every day, the weight of his situation grew heavier, and the walls around him seemed to close in just a little more. But Max had always been there, in the background, a constant presence. Jack remembered the day he found Max, just a stray pup, alone in an alley, looking lost and scared. It hadn't taken long for the two of them to form a bond. Max had grown up alongside Jack, and in many ways, the dog had become his anchor. When Jack had hit rock bottom, it was Max who had pulled him back up. Maybe that's all life really is, Jack thought to himself. A series of moments that try to break you, and the people, or animals, who hold you together. The door opened again, and Daniel stepped inside, this time with a more serious look on his face. "Harris, the warden said you can see your dog. But there are conditions. You only get 5 minutes, and it'll be under supervision. No exceptions." Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was happening. He was going to see Max. "Thank you," Jack said quietly, his eyes welling up with emotion. He didn't know how to thank someone for this small mercy. It wasn't going to change his fate, but it was something. Something that meant the world to him. Minutes later, Jack was led down a series of hallways, his footsteps echoing off the cold concrete floor. He could feel his palms sweating, his pulse quickening. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare him for how it would feel in reality. When they reached the small outdoor courtyard, there was Max, sitting patiently by the gate. As soon as the dog saw Jack, his tail began to wag, and he ran to the fence, barking excitedly. When they reached the small outdoor courtyard, there was Max, sitting patiently by the gate. As soon as the dog saw Jack, his tail began to wag, and he ran to the fence, barking excitedly. Jack's heart swelled with emotion. He crouched down, reaching his hand through the bars, and Max eagerly nuzzled it, his warm fur brushing against Jack's fingers. For a moment, everything else faded away. The prison, the execution, the injustice, it all seemed so distant. In this moment, all that mattered was the bond between a man and his dog. "Hey, boy," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I couldn't do better by you. I just wish we had more time." Max's eyes seemed to understand. There was a calmness in the dog's gaze that made Jack feel like everything would be okay, even if it wasn't. Max had been his companion through it all, and in these final moments, he wasn't alone. The guard cleared his throat, signaling that the time was almost up. Jack stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Max. The dog gave one last bark, as if to say goodbye, and then Jack was escorted back to his cell. As he lay on his cot, Jack's mind wandered back to the question he had asked earlier: what happens when everything you know is taken from you? The answer was simple: you find a way to keep going, no matter how dark it gets. And sometimes, the smallest moments, the simplest things, can make all the difference. Jack closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Something was coming. And he could feel it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jack had always been the kind of man who kept his emotions close to his chest. Life had taught him early on that the world wasn't always kind, and showing vulnerability was a luxury few could afford. But there was something about Max, something in the way the dog's brown eyes seemed to understand him in ways that no human ever could, that made him feel safe. It was the kind of unconditional love that Jack had never really known, not from anyone else, not even from his family. It hadn't always been this way. In fact, Jack's life had been anything but smooth. He had been raised in a small town, the son of a mechanic and a stay-at-home mother. His family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either. They had enough to get by, and for a while, that was enough for Jack. But as he grew older, he began to realize that his parents' world, their simple, predictable life, wasn't what he wanted for himself. At the age of 18, Jack enlisted in the army. It wasn't a decision that came lightly, but it felt right at the time. It was a chance to escape the small town, to do something bigger, something that mattered. And for a while, it was everything he'd hoped for. The discipline, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, it gave him a direction in life. He was good at what he did. His superiors liked him. His friends respected him. But then came the deployment. Jack had always been idealistic about serving his country. He believed in duty, honor, and sacrifice. But nothing had prepared him for the horrors of war. The constant danger, the never-ending noise of gunfire, the faces of men, some of them younger than him, who wouldn't make it out alive. The longer he stayed, the more the war stripped away his humanity, piece by piece. It wasn't long before Jack became numb. He'd seen too much, too many young men lost to senseless violence. The line between right and wrong blurred, and the definition of duty began to fade. That was when he first met Max. Max had been a stray dog in the middle of a war zone, scavenging through debris and rubble. Jack had found him one night after a particularly brutal skirmish. The dog was scared, malnourished, but his eyes had held a kind of quiet resilience that reminded Jack of himself. With the little food Jack had left, he fed the dog, and from that moment on, Max followed him everywhere. It wasn't much at first, a few scraps of food, a warm place to sleep on cold nights, but it was enough. Max became Jack's constant companion, a tether to something human in the midst of the madness. When Jack would wake up in the middle of the night from nightmares, it was Max who would nuzzle him, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. As the months passed, Max became more than just a dog. He became Jack's anchor. In a world that had grown increasingly hostile and unpredictable, Max was the one thing that made sense. No matter how much the war changed him, Max was always the same, loyal, loving, and always there when Jack needed him. But when the deployment finally ended, Jack's life didn't get any easier. He returned home a changed man. The country he had fought for, the people he had risked everything for, didn't seem the same to him anymore. His friends couldn't understand the nightmares that plagued him, the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. His family tried to be supportive, but the distance between them seemed insurmountable. The hardest part was coming to terms with the fact that he couldn't find peace, not even when he was home. The war had left its mark on him, and no one, not even his parents, could fully grasp the depth of the pain he carried. It wasn't just the memories of the battlefield, it was the feeling of being disconnected, of not belonging anywhere. And that was when Max became his lifeline. Max was there when Jack had trouble sleeping, when the anger seemed to overtake him. Max was there when Jack spiraled into depression, when he felt like he had no reason to keep going. In those darkest moments, the dog was a reminder that someone cared. That, despite the world's cruelty, there was still something good, something pure, waiting for him to come back to it. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Jack began to trust Max more than he trusted anyone else. The dog was his companion, his confidant, the one being in his life who never judged him. And when he faced the accusations, when he was arrested and wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit, Max was the one constant he could cling to. Even as Jack sat on death row, awaiting his execution, Max was the one thing that never left his thoughts. Max was more than a pet. He was family. He was the only one who understood the parts of Jack that no one else could. The day Jack was sentenced, he had stood in front of the judge, unable to comprehend how everything had unraveled so quickly. The trial had been a blur. He hadn't even known the people who had testified against him. It had all felt like a bad dream, one that he couldn't wake up from. The prosecutor's words rang in his ears: the defendant is guilty of murder. The sentence is death. Jack hadn't fought back. There was no point. The system had already decided his fate. But throughout the entire ordeal, Max had been there. In the courtroom, in the holding cells, in the small moments of solitude before the trial. Jack would close his eyes, and there was Max, his soft fur against Jack's chest as the dog rested his head on Jack's lap. No matter how dark the world got, Max was there. The request to see Max before his execution wasn't just a whim. It wasn't just some final act of defiance or a plea for comfort in his last moments. It was the culmination of everything that had brought him here. The bond between man and dog, the loyalty that had never faltered, and the simple truth that sometimes, in the darkest moments of life, it's the smallest things that can make all the difference. Jack had no illusions about the outcome. He knew what awaited him. But as he looked at Max one last time, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Max was more than just a dog. He was Jack's last connection to the life he had once known, to the man he had once been before the world had turned its back on him. And in that moment, as he said goodbye, Jack realized that maybe, just maybe, he had one final chance to make a difference, to change something, to leave behind a legacy that wasn't defined by guilt or punishment, but by love and loyalty. The sun was setting when Jack was led back to his cell, the fading light casting long shadows across the concrete floors of the prison. He felt oddly detached, as if everything around him, every sound, every step, was happening in some far-off place that didn't quite reach him. In the moments before he was returned to his confinement, he had stood face to face with Max, the dog's warm brown eyes filled with an understanding Jack didn't have words for. It had been a small moment, just a handful of minutes, but it was enough. It had to be enough. As he walked back toward his cell, Jack couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of calm and dread. The fear, which had plagued him for so long, was no longer present. Maybe it had dissipated in the presence of his dog, or maybe Jack had just come to terms with what was coming. Either way, it was as though something had changed inside him, a shift that he couldn't quite explain, but knew in the deepest part of his being. 5 more days, Jack muttered to himself as he trudged through the hallways, past rows of locked doors and silent cells. 5 more days. The guard walking beside him, Officer Daniels, said nothing. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a silence that didn't need to be broken. Daniels had seen many prisoners face the end, but there was something different about Jack. Despite the severity of his crime, something that had torn apart an entire family, Jack had shown a kind of dignity in his last days that the others hadn't. It wasn't the usual pleading, the begging for a reprieve, the promise of remorse. No, Jack hadn't done that. He had been resigned, almost peaceful in his acceptance of what was to come. "Do you ever wonder what it's like?" Jack asked as they reached his cell, his voice low, but his curiosity genuine. "I mean, after it's all over. Do you think there's anything more? Or is it just, nothing?" Officer Daniels paused, his hand hovering over the lock of the cell door. He had been asked this question before by others, prisoners, often with little time left, but he never had an answer. The truth was, he didn't know what happened after death. All he had was the evidence of what he saw, the men who went through their final days, the ones who screamed for a second chance, and the ones who accepted their fate with quiet dignity. But no one ever knew what came next. "I don't know," Daniels replied finally. "I guess we'll all find out eventually." Jack didn't say anything more as the door clanged shut behind him. The sound of it echoed in the small, empty cell. For a moment, all he could hear was his own breathing, slow and steady. And then, as if on cue, memories began to flood his mind, memories of a life that seemed so distant now. Growing up in the small town of Marlow, Jack had known little about the darkness that existed outside the borders of his childhood world. The town was quiet, peaceful, and everything seemed to move at a slow pace. The neighbors knew each other's names, the local diner was a hub of gossip and community news, and life felt safe, even predictable. Jack's father worked as a mechanic, fixing cars and tending to the occasional farm equipment, while his mother baked pies and made sure Jack was always at the dinner table when the sun went down. In those days, Jack had been a dreamer. He was always the first to jump into something new, to explore the limits of what he could do, to find new challenges. At school, he was known as the quiet kid with a strong sense of curiosity. He wasn't popular, but he didn't mind. He had his books, his thoughts, and his dreams of one day leaving Marlow and seeing the world. It wasn't that he didn't love his family or his hometown. He just felt like he was meant for something more. Then came the decision to enlist. It wasn't something his parents had been thrilled about, but Jack had always been determined. When he joined the army, he wasn't running away from anything. He was running toward a dream, a sense of purpose that had eluded him in Marlow. His decision to serve his country was based on an idealism that no longer existed in the man he had become. As Jack sat on his cot in the dim light of his cell, the memories of war came rushing back. He remembered the endless days of conflict, the constant pressure to keep moving, the near-death experiences that had become so routine he could barely separate them anymore. And then there was Max, his constant, his companion through it all. Jack had seen other soldiers break under the weight of the war, but he had never been one of them. Max had given him a reason to keep going, a reason to survive each day. Even when Jack had wanted to quit, to let the darkness swallow him whole, Max had kept him tethered to something good, something pure. When Jack had been discharged and returned home, the world he came back to was nothing like the one he had left. The war had changed him, twisted him into something unrecognizable. He found himself struggling to fit back into the life he once knew. His family didn't understand the man he had become, and his friends, those few who had stuck around, didn't know how to help him. The nightmares started shortly after he returned, vivid images of the battlefield, of men he had known, of faces that would never leave him. He could hear the sound of gunfire even when he wasn't asleep, feel the weight of his rifle against his shoulder as though the war had never truly ended. His mind drifted back to the present, back to the quiet cell where he was awaiting the final chapter of his life. The only constant in this nightmare had been Max. The dog had been there for him through the worst of times, never asking questions, never judging. Just there, faithfully. Jack sat up straight, his eyes scanning the small room. He had never thought much about how he would die, only that he would. But now, with the days counting down, he had begun to think about what he would leave behind. It wasn't much. A few personal effects. A tarnished reputation. But Max. Max would carry the memory of him forward. And that was all Jack could hope for. Maybe it wouldn't be much to others, but to him, it was everything. He closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. 5 more days. That was all he had left. The door to his cell opened again, and Daniel stepped inside with a clipboard in hand. "Harris," he said, his voice still calm but with a hint of urgency. "There's a visitor for you." Jack didn't move at first. A visitor? Who would want to see him now? His family had abandoned him long ago, and the trial was over. No one cared about Jack Harris anymore. But then the guard spoke again, and his words made Jack's heart stop. "Your lawyer," Daniel said. "She's here." Jack's mind raced. His lawyer? It had been so long since he had heard from her. Could this be some kind of reprieve? A last-minute miracle? But no. It wasn't that simple. Jack wasn't sure what to think when Officer Daniels announced that his lawyer had arrived. The words felt like a distant echo, something he'd heard before but never fully processed. It wasn't as if he had any hope left. He had spent months, maybe years, resigning himself to the inevitable. But hearing that someone still cared enough to show up, especially after everything that had happened, struck Jack in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "Come on," Daniel said, breaking Jack from his trance. The officer's voice was firm but not unkind, as though he were offering some small shred of comfort amidst the bleakness of Jack's situation. Jack followed Daniels down the narrow corridor that led to the visitation room. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the gravity of the situation was bearing down on him in ways he hadn't expected. When he reached the small, sterile room with its one metal chair on each side of the glass partition, his heart began to race. Could this be it? Could there really be a chance? He had lost count of how many legal appeals had been filed on his behalf, each one dismissed as quickly as the last. What good would one more meeting with his lawyer do? But still, he couldn't push the tiny spark of hope from his chest. Officer Daniels opened the door to the room, and Jack stepped inside. His lawyer was already seated on the other side of the glass, a figure he hadn't seen in months. Her name was Laura Simmons, an attorney who had been assigned to his case after his conviction. At first, Jack hadn't put much stock into her. She was just another suit, another person doing their job, and he had been too far gone to think anyone would actually help. But over time, Laura had proven herself different. She was persistent, thoughtful, and, perhaps most importantly, human. She had believed Jack from the very beginning, something no one else had done. Laura looked tired, her face drawn and pale from lack of sleep. Her once perfect suit was slightly wrinkled, and she clutched a folder in her hand, as though it were the last lifeline she had to offer. "Jack," she said softly as she stood, pressing her hands against the glass. Her voice trembled slightly, but she was still composed, still determined. "I've been working on something. I need you to listen to me." Jack moved toward the small seat opposite her, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't nerves, it was something else. A sense of disbelief mixed with the faintest stirrings of hope. "Listen, Laura," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know why you're still here. The case is closed. The trial's over. It's done. I'm not going to be walking out of here." He paused, his throat tightening. "And I've made peace with that." Laura shook her head, her eyes wide with urgency. "Jack, no. You don't understand. I've been going through everything again. I've found something. There's a legal loophole, a mistake in the trial. It's not over yet." Jack stared at her, disbelief written all over his face. "A mistake? What are you talking about? There were witnesses. There was evidence. You saw it all. I was guilty. I know I was. I don't even blame anyone for what happened to me." Laura's face softened. She lowered her voice so only Jack could hear. "You were wrongfully convicted, Jack. You didn't kill that man. I found the evidence that proves it." The words hung in the air between them, dense and heavy, as though they were too large for the tiny room to contain. Jack blinked, trying to wrap his mind around what Laura had just said. "Laura, what are you talking about?" he whispered, his heart pounding now, as though the walls around him were closing in. "You can't be serious. How can you be sure? The trial, the evidence, all of it pointed to me." She leaned forward, pressing her hands flat against the glass, her eyes pleading with him. "The testimony of the key witness was fabricated. I found the original police report, Jack. There were inconsistencies. They never should have used that as evidence. I can't explain it all right now, but I've got enough to prove your innocence." Jack's mind reeled. His body went numb. All the months he had spent in this hellhole, all the nights he had lay awake, accepting his fate, it had all been based on a lie. The system had failed him, but there was something out there, something that could change everything. "How do you know this?" Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Laura smiled faintly, the first real sign of hope he had seen in her eyes for what felt like forever. "Because I've been digging. I never stopped, Jack. I've been talking to people, going through old documents, looking for something, anything that could change this. And now I have it." Jack's head swam. This was too much to process. For so long, he had believed there was no way out. And now, in his final days, he was being told there was a chance he could walk free. Was it possible? Could the system really be that wrong? Could he, Jack Harris, really be innocent? "Laura," Jack said, his voice shaking with emotion, "what do we do now? How soon can we get this to the courts?" She held up the folder she had been carrying, her eyes fixed on Jack with a seriousness that made him sit up straighter. "We file for a stay of execution. I can't promise anything, but if we act fast, there's a slim chance we can get this overturned. I'll need your help, Jack. You have to trust me. This is our last shot." Jack's heart raced. It felt surreal, almost too good to be true. I'll do whatever it takes, Laura. Just, tell me what you need. She nodded, her voice firm with the certainty Jack had missed in the months before. I need you to stay strong, Jack. You've come this far. We're not done yet. As the officer escorted Jack back to his cell, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. His execution was just days away, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. It was as though the world had shifted, and something bigger than him was finally stepping in. Jack didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he could believe in a future at all. The hours seemed to stretch into infinity as Jack sat in his cell, his mind racing. The words Laura had spoken still echoed in his head, refusing to leave him. Wrongfully convicted. Inconsistencies. I found something. Could it really be true? Could everything he had endured, everything he had accepted as his fate, be based on a mistake? He was too afraid to believe it, too terrified to allow himself to hope. Every part of him wanted to reach for that flicker of hope, to believe that a mistake had been made, that he might still have a chance. But his mind kept returning to the same question: if Laura was right, how had it all gone so wrong? How had they convicted him, and why had it taken so long for anyone to realize? Jack leaned against the cold concrete wall, his fingers running over the rough surface as though trying to ground himself. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shadows. The night had settled in, and with it, a thick silence that seemed to weigh on the entire prison. The sounds of the outside world had been shut out, and only the distant echoes of footsteps and the occasional murmur of guards reminded Jack that there was still life beyond the walls that had become his prison. But tonight, there was something different. Something new. His lawyer, Laura Simmons, had given him a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: the possibility of redemption. The possibility of life. Stay strong, she had said, her words steady and sure. Jack had tried to hold on to that, but the uncertainty was like a gnawing hunger in the pit of his stomach. What if they couldn't prove his innocence? What if the legal system was too broken, too corrupted, to save him? And then there was the ticking clock. His execution was still scheduled for 5 days from now, and while Laura had promised to fight for a stay, the chances of success were slim. Jack had seen the statistics, knew the odds. People didn't get second chances in prison, and those who did rarely made it out. His situation felt like the exception to every rule. 5 more days, Jack whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the cold, sterile room. 5 more days. A knock on the door startled him. It was Officer Daniels again, his face unreadable as always. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped inside, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. You've got another visitor, Daniels said, his voice low and careful. Jack stood up, a feeling of dread settling in his chest. Who else could possibly be coming to see him now? His family had long since given up on him, and as far as he knew, his friends had either moved on or lost track of him. Who is it? Jack asked, his voice hoarse, a little more than a whisper. It's someone from your past, Daniels replied, giving nothing away. Jack felt a ripple of confusion but said nothing. Whoever it was, they'd have to go through the same security checks as everyone else. The guards weren't about to let anyone in without permission, and they certainly wouldn't risk Jack's life for some random visitor. Daniels led him down another corridor, one he hadn't walked in months. The hall was dimly lit, and the air felt thick with the weight of the history in these walls. Each step Jack took felt heavier than the last, his shoes scraping against the concrete floor like the sound of an impending doom. As they reached the visitor's room, Jack felt his chest tighten. What was going on? Why would someone from his past want to see him now, when everything was falling apart? The door creaked open, and Jack stepped inside. Seated across from the glass partition was a man Jack hadn't seen in years. A face he never thought he'd see again. Ben. Jack's voice cracked as he said the name. Ben Reed? The man on the other side of the glass didn't respond immediately. His eyes were tired, bloodshot as if he hadn't slept in days. His face was thinner than Jack remembered, but there was no mistaking the familiar features. Ben Reed had been Jack's closest friend during their time in the military. They had trained together, fought together, and survived together. Ben was the one person Jack had trusted more than anyone else in the world. But something had happened after they returned from deployment. Ben had been assigned to another unit, and their lives had diverged. "Yeah," Ben said after a long pause, his voice hoarse. "It's me, Jack. Long time, no see." Jack wasn't sure what to say. He couldn't reconcile the man he saw before him with the one he remembered from their time in the military. Ben had always been strong, confident, and resolute. But the man sitting on the other side of the glass now was a shadow of that person, worn down by time and grief. "Why are you here, Ben?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. What do you want from me now?" Ben took a deep breath and leaned forward, his hands clasped together in front of him. "Jack, I've been trying to get in here for weeks. I need you to listen to me. I know what happened." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, you know what happened?" Ben's gaze never wavered as he spoke, his voice steady but laden with something Jack couldn't quite place. "I know the truth about what went down that night. I should have said something before, but I was too scared. I thought I could forget about it, move on. But I can't. And I can't let you go to your death with a lie hanging over your head." Jack's chest tightened as he processed Ben's words. His mind raced. What was Ben talking about? What truth? Jack had lived with his guilt for so long that the idea of someone he trusted, saying he knew something different was almost impossible to accept. "I don't understand," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. "What truth? What are you talking about, Ben?" Ben looked at him with a pained expression. "I was there, Jack. I saw everything. I saw who really did it. And it wasn't you." Jack couldn't breathe. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat heavy with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Ben's words echoed in his mind, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. "I saw who really did it. And it wasn't you." His hands were shaking, and he pressed them against the glass, as if trying to reach through the partition that separated him from his old friend. There was a moment of silence, thick and suffocating, as Jack tried to process what Ben had just said. His brain refused to accept it. The entire case had been built on the belief that Jack was the one responsible for the murder. The evidence, the testimonies, everything had pointed to him. But now, Ben was claiming he had seen the truth, a truth that could shatter everything. Jack's voice trembled as he spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Ben, what are you talking about? What truth? I don't understand." "You were there." Ben nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret and guilt. "I should have said something sooner. But I didn't want to get involved. I thought I could put it all behind me. I thought you were guilty, too. But I saw it. I saw who did it, Jack. I saw the whole thing." Jack's mind was a blur of confusion. He couldn't process the information fast enough. His friend, the one person he had trusted more than anyone else, had been there. Had witnessed the crime. And yet, for some reason, he had kept quiet. Why? What was holding Ben back all these years? "Why didn't you come forward?" Jack asked, the words escaping his lips before he could stop them. "Why now? Why wait until I'm about to be executed?" Ben's face twisted in pain, and for the first time, Jack saw just how broken his old friend had become. "I didn't know what to do, Jack. I was scared. They would have crucified me. They would have thought I was complicit. And I didn't think it mattered anymore. I thought you were guilty, too. I didn't know how to help you. But now, I can't let you die with a lie on your head." Jack stared at him, feeling the weight of Ben's words crash down on him like a ton of bricks. Who did it, Ben? Who was it? Ben hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting away from Jack's gaze. It was someone from your past, Jack. Someone you trusted. Someone you never would have suspected. The statement hit Jack like a physical blow. Someone he trusted. Someone he never would have suspected. He had no idea who Ben was talking about. The puzzle pieces were scattered, and Jack couldn't make sense of them. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. All this time, he had believed he was the one who had taken a life, believed it so strongly that he had resigned himself to it. And now, Ben was telling him it wasn't true. Who, Ben? Jack asked again, more forcefully this time. Who was it? Ben took a deep breath, his eyes clouded with pain. It was John Masters. Your old unit commander. The name hit Jack like a thunderclap. John Masters. His former commanding officer. Jack had never thought about him in years, but the name stirred memories that Jack had long since buried. Masters had been a harsh, demanding leader, but he had always seemed to have the best interests of his men at heart, or so Jack had thought. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Masters? Jack repeated, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. But why? Why would he do something like this? Why frame me? Ben leaned in closer, his eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. I don't know why, Jack. But I saw him that night. He was the one who killed that man, not you. I tried to get a good look at him, but I was too far away. But when I heard the details of the case, everything clicked. The way the evidence was twisted. The way the witnesses were manipulated. It all pointed to you, Jack, because Masters knew no one would suspect him. Jack felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. John Masters, the man who had once been his leader, the man he had trusted implicitly, had been the one responsible for the murder. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But Ben's words were clear. The truth had been hidden all this time. And now, Jack had to confront it. Why didn't you come forward, Ben? Jack asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Why didn't you tell someone sooner? This is my life we're talking about. Ben's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Jack saw the broken man that his friend had become. I was scared, Jack. I was scared of what Masters would do. I was scared he would ruin my life, too. And I didn't know how to prove it. But I can't sit back anymore. I know I was wrong. I should have said something, but I didn't. I can't let you die for something you didn't do. Jack's chest tightened as he processed Ben's words. The guilt that had plagued him for so long, the guilt he had carried on his shoulders like a heavy, unrelenting weight, was now being replaced with a searing anger. Anger at Masters. Anger at the system that had failed him. Anger at the people who had allowed this to happen. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jack felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure if it was hope or rage, but it was there, burning brightly. The possibility of redemption, of freedom, was no longer just a distant dream. It was real. I need you to help me, Ben, Jack said, his voice low but firm. I need you to come forward. I need you to tell them what you saw. We need to get this to the courts. You have to testify. Ben shook his head, a pained expression crossing his face. I will, Jack. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. But it's not going to be easy. Masters has a lot of influence. And if we're going to have a chance, we need to act fast. Jack nodded, the weight of the task ahead settling in. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt a flicker of hope. He had a chance now. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. Thank you, Ben, Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me a chance. Ben gave him a weak smile, his eyes full of regret and guilt. I should have done this long ago, Jack. I'm sorry. But I'll make it right. I promise. As the guard signaled the end of the visit, Jack stood up, his heart pounding with a newfound sense of determination. For the first time in a long while, he had a plan. And he wasn't going to let it die with him. The days following Jack's conversation with Ben felt like a blur, each hour dragging on, longer than the last. The sense of urgency gnawed at him as his execution date loomed ever closer. He had heard the clanging of the prison doors countless times, but now each echo felt like a countdown to something inevitable. But this time, there was a flicker of hope. A chance, however slim, that he could change the course of his fate. Ben's promise to testify had given Jack a sense of purpose, but it was far from a guarantee. Jack knew that Masters, John Masters, wasn't just any former commander. He was a man with power, connections, and a deep understanding of how to manipulate the system. Jack could already hear the objections, the doubts, the opposition that would surely come from every direction. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be clean. And yet, Jack couldn't let the chance slip by. He wasn't going to die in a cell, knowing the truth was out there but out of his reach. He couldn't. The days passed with excruciating slowness. Each moment felt like an eternity as Jack, sitting alone in his cell, steeled himself for what was to come. It wasn't just the legal battle that weighed heavily on him. There was also the unspoken tension in the air, the realization that the clock was ticking down. His execution was still scheduled for the 5th day from now, and despite Laura's promises, despite Ben's testimony, the reality of the situation was still overwhelming. Jack was pulled from his thoughts when a familiar voice broke through the silence. "Jack, you need to listen to me." Laura's voice was firm, but there was a thin layer of desperation beneath her words. She was standing on the other side of the bars, her face pale, her eyes dark with exhaustion. The past few days had clearly taken their toll on her, too. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his heart racing. "Have you heard from Ben? Is he willing to testify?" Laura nodded slowly, but her expression was grim. "Ben's statement is crucial. But we have a problem. We need more than just his testimony if we want to have any chance of stopping your execution." Jack's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? What else can we do? I thought this was our shot." Laura's jaw tightened. "I know. But Masters has an alibi. A solid one. And we don't have enough to disprove it. We need more, something concrete. Something that will make the court believe that Masters is guilty and that you were framed." Jack's blood ran cold. "What kind of evidence are we talking about, Laura?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We need documents. We need a record of Masters' involvement in the case, something that links him directly to the crime. It could be anything, emails, paperwork, communication with someone involved in the investigation. Anything that shows he was pulling the strings from behind the scenes." Jack clenched his fists. It felt like the walls were closing in around him. But where do we find that? How do we get access to something like that? Laura's expression softened slightly. "We're going to have to get creative. There's a file room, deep in the bowels of the courthouse. It's where they keep all the records, but it's not easily accessible. We'll need someone on the inside to help us get in there. And there's one person I think might be able to do that." Jack's brow furrowed. "Who?" Laura hesitated for a moment before replying. "I'm going to contact an old friend. A former clerk who worked in the courthouse. She owes me a favor. If anyone can help us get access to those files, it's her." Jack nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. If they could get their hands on those records, it could be the breakthrough they so desperately needed. But even then, it wasn't a guarantee. They had to move fast, time was running out. "I trust you, Laura," Jack said, his voice steady. "Let's do whatever it takes. We can't let this slip through our fingers." Laura gave him a tight smile, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. I'll contact her right now. We have to be careful. If Masters finds out what we're doing, we could all be in even more danger. Jack nodded, understanding the stakes. This wasn't just about his life anymore. If they went up against Masters, they would be taking on someone who had the power to destroy everything. But Jack didn't have a choice. He wasn't going to sit idly by and let this go on any longer. He would fight, no matter what the cost. As Laura turned to leave, Jack's thoughts drifted back to Ben. He had made a promise to his old friend, one that now felt like a lifeline in a sea of darkness. He had to make sure Ben was protected, too. They couldn't let Masters silence him before the truth came to light. Jack spent the rest of the day pacing in his cell, the minutes ticking by as if they were seconds. His mind raced, trying to piece together all the fragments of information he had. Ben's statement, the possible evidence, and the clock counting down to his execution. Everything was a puzzle, and he was determined to find the missing pieces before it was too late. That evening, when the guard brought Jack his dinner, he barely noticed the food. His mind was elsewhere, caught up in the urgency of the situation. But as he sat at the small table, his thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps outside his cell. A familiar figure appeared at the bars. It was Ben. Jack stood up quickly, his heart pounding as he stepped toward the bars. Ben, what's going on? Have you heard anything from Laura? Ben shook his head, his face drawn and tired. I haven't heard from her yet. But I had to come by. I don't know if it'll help, but I've been digging. Looking into Masters. And I found something. Jack's heart skipped a beat. What did you find? Ben leaned in closer, his voice low. I found a connection. Masters was involved in another case, a similar one, years ago. It was covered up, but there are rumors that he did the same thing, framed someone else for a murder he committed. I think it might be the key to everything. But I need to get my hands on the files to prove it. Jack's mind raced. We can't waste any time. Laura's trying to get access to the courthouse files. If we can get them, we might be able to prove everything. But we have to move fast. Masters won't let this go easily. Ben nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. I'm in, Jack. Whatever it takes, we'll get the truth out there. I'm not going to let you die for something you didn't do. As the conversation came to a close and Ben walked away, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. And with every passing second, the stakes only grew higher. The next morning, the air in Jack's cell felt colder, more oppressive. He had barely slept, his mind too consumed with the urgency of their mission. He knew that time was running out, and every second that ticked by brought him closer to the unthinkable, his execution. But today, something was different. There was a plan in motion. Laura had contacted her old friend, and Ben had uncovered a lead. Now, all they had to do was put the pieces together before Masters had the chance to stop them. When the guard came to escort Jack to his scheduled meeting with Laura, Jack was ready. His heart thudded in his chest with anticipation. He had no idea how the day would unfold, but he couldn't afford to sit back and wait for fate to decide his future. The time for passivity had passed. It was time to act. As Jack was led into the visitor's room, he saw Laura waiting for him, her expression determined, but also strained. She was doing her best to hold everything together, but Jack could tell she was just as scared as he was. The pressure of everything resting on her shoulders was enormous, and yet, she kept going. Jack, she said quietly, standing as he approached. I heard from her. We have access to the files. Jack's heart skipped a beat. You got through to her? Laura nodded, her face tight with both relief and worry. Yes. She's in. The problem is, the files are locked down pretty tightly, and she can't do this alone. I'm going to need you to help her, Jack. We're running out of time, and if we don't move quickly, Masters will know we're onto him. Jack didn't hesitate. I'm in. Whatever it takes. Laura gave him a long, meaningful look. You don't understand. If we get caught, if we're caught snooping around those records, we could all be in serious trouble. You could be charged with obstruction or worse. We'll be walking a razor's edge. Jack nodded grimly. I'm ready. I don't have a choice. Okay, Laura said, her voice steady despite the fear flickering in her eyes. Here's the plan. We're going to need a distraction to keep Masters and anyone else who might be watching off our trail. I'll take care of that, but I need you to get to the courthouse. We don't have much time. The weight of the task ahead pressed heavily on Jack's shoulders, but he forced himself to stay focused. Tell me exactly what I need to do. Laura looked at him, her eyes hard and determined. You'll meet her at the courthouse. You'll only have a few minutes to get in, grab what you need, and get out. She's going to provide you with the access codes to the security system, and she knows where to look. But once you're in, it's all on you. We can't afford any mistakes. Jack nodded once, his mind already working through the logistics. The risk was immense, but the reward, the chance to prove his innocence, was worth everything. The two of them spent the next few minutes going over the details, making sure they were both on the same page. When they were finished, Laura gave Jack one last look, her gaze lingering as if trying to burn the image of him into her memory, in case it was the last time she saw him. Be careful, she said softly, a crack of emotion in her voice. I will, Jack replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. And Laura? Thank you. For everything. With a final nod, Jack was escorted back to his cell, where the waiting game began again. The moment stretched endlessly as he stood there, replaying everything in his mind, mentally preparing for the hardest, most dangerous thing he had ever done. But nothing, not even the specter of death hanging over him, was going to stop him now. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let it all slip away. Hours passed, and as the evening drew near, Jack was informed that a visitor was waiting for him. His pulse quickened as he was led down the familiar hallways of the prison. His mind raced, had Laura been successful in her efforts? Was the plan going ahead as they had discussed? When he entered the visitor's room, he saw her immediately. She was a small woman, with short-cropped blonde hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked out of place here, in the drab, oppressive room. Her name was Caroline, and she was the old courthouse clerk Laura had contacted. Jack, she said, standing as he walked in. Her voice was low and purposeful, betraying none of the nerves that Jack knew she must have been feeling. I'm here to help. But you need to understand that this is going to be risky. I can only do so much. Jack gave her a tight smile, his heart pounding in his chest. I know. But we have to do this. It's my only chance. Caroline handed him a small folder, and he opened it carefully. Inside was a stack of papers, along with a small USB drive. She spoke in a hushed tone, leaning in slightly. These are the access codes for the system. I've managed to bypass the security measures, but the files you need are locked behind several layers. You'll have 5 minutes to get what you need. If you're caught, I can't help you. I'm already pushing my limits just being here. Jack nodded, feeling the gravity of the situation settle in. 5 minutes. Understood. I've marked the specific files on the USB, Caroline continued. They'll lead you straight to the documents that show Master's involvement. If you find them, you've won. But it won't be easy. Stay alert. Thank you, Jack said, his voice thick with gratitude and anxiety. He could feel the weight of her actions on him, and it made his resolve harden even further. We won't forget this. Caroline gave him a quick nod, a fleeting smile crossing her face. Good luck. As Jack left the room, he felt as though he were walking toward the edge of a cliff, each step bringing him closer to a future that was still uncertain. But this was it. This was his chance to finally get the truth out. It all hinged on what he could do in the next few minutes. The prison seemed quieter than usual as he was escorted to the waiting transport vehicle. He couldn't help but feel the weight of every step, knowing the stakes had never been higher. Masters was getting closer to silencing him forever, but Jack wasn't going to let it happen without a fight. The ride to the courthouse felt like a journey to another world, one filled with danger, but also the hope of redemption. Jack's pulse raced as he prepared for the challenge ahead. The courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, its stone walls towering under the darkening sky. Jack could almost feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The building wasn't just a place of legal proceedings, it was where his life, and possibly the truth, hung in the balance. The air felt thick with tension, as if even the winds knew how precarious this moment was. Jack sat in the back of the transport van, heart pounding as the city lights flickered in the distance. His mind was locked onto one single thought: he couldn't fail. Not this time. "Keep your head down, Jack," the driver grunted from the front. "We're only passing through the back entrance, so don't make a scene. In and out, quick. That's how this has to go." Jack barely nodded, but he couldn't help feeling the weight of the guard's words. Everything had to go perfectly. There was no room for error. If they got caught now, it would all be over. The van pulled up to a side entrance of the courthouse, and Jack was escorted out with a firm hand at his elbow. The cold air bit at his skin, a sharp contrast to the warm, claustrophobic atmosphere inside the prison. He wasn't used to this kind of freedom, if you could even call it that. He was still shackled, under heavy surveillance, walking in a world that wasn't his. But today, he was here for something else. He was here for answers. They moved through the back halls of the courthouse with military precision. Jack was guided down a narrow corridor, dimly lit and eerily silent. His footsteps echoed softly against the cold tile, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Every step felt like it could be his last, but he pushed forward. Caroline, who had given him the files and instructions, was already waiting in a small storage room at the far end of the hall. She looked more nervous than Jack had ever seen her, her hands fidgeting as she glanced at the clock on the wall. "This is it," she said, her voice tight with nerves. "You've got 5 minutes. You know the files you need to find. Do you have the USB?" Jack nodded, clutching the small device tightly in his hand. The drive felt like it weighed a ton in his palm, but there was no time to second-guess. He had to move fast. Caroline gestured toward a steel door at the end of the room. "That's the access point to the records vault. You've got to bypass the security system first. I've given you the codes, but you'll need to be fast." "How do I get in?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Type the codes into the terminal by the door. The system's old, so it won't take long, but you'll have to manually unlock the gate. The vault itself is a maze of shelves, but the documents you need are in the back section. The ones about Masters. Everything's labeled on the drive." Jack's stomach churned as he made his way to the terminal, feeling the heat of the moment rising. His hands shook slightly as he inserted the USB drive into the port. The screen blinked to life, and for a brief moment, he felt like he was staring into the abyss. One wrong move, and the entire plan could unravel. He followed the instructions carefully, typing in the code. The screen flashed with a confirmation, and the door clicked open. The vault was now accessible. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't have much time. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark, labyrinthine space. The shelves were lined with dusty records, old files stacked haphazardly on top of one another. A heavy, metallic scent lingered in the air, mingling with the mustiness of years of untended paperwork. Jack had to squint in the dim light, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. There was a momentary silence, a stillness that hung like a thick curtain. Then, his heart skipped a beat. He heard footsteps approaching. Someone was coming. "Shit," Jack muttered under his breath. He quickly scanned the room for a hiding place, his instincts kicking in. The room was cluttered, but there was no time to waste. He had to find those documents before anyone could see him. He ducked behind a row of filing cabinets, holding his breath as the footsteps grew louder. He could hear muffled voices, and his pulse began to race. The guards were making their rounds. If they found him now, it would all be over. Jack waited, his body tense, as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. He dared not move, not even a fraction. The door to the vault creaked as someone pressed their hand against it. He could feel his chest tighten as the seconds ticked by like hours. But the footsteps eventually receded, moving further down the corridor. Jack exhaled sharply, a silent prayer slipping from his lips. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the moment, he was safe. He glanced at the clock. The seconds were ticking away. 5 minutes. He had to move faster. Jack straightened up and moved deeper into the vault. He spotted the file he was looking for, Master's file, tucked at the back of one of the shelves. His fingers trembled as he pulled it from the dusty rack. He opened the file carefully, his heart racing as he scanned the papers inside. There it was. A series of documents detailing Master's involvement in the corruption case. The names of people he'd manipulated. The paper trail that connected him directly to the murder Jack had been accused of. He was so close. This was it. The evidence that could save him. But just as Jack was about to pull out the most important document, the door to the vault suddenly swung open. His blood ran cold. A guard appeared in the doorway. "Who are you?" The guard demanded, his eyes narrowing as he took in Jack's presence. Jack froze, panic flooding his veins. His mind raced for a plan, but in that instant, everything seemed to slow down. The guard stepped forward, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt. Jack didn't think. He just acted. He grabbed the first thing within reach, a stack of papers, and hurled them at the guard's face. The guard stumbled back in surprise, knocking over a filing cabinet. Papers scattered in all directions, and Jack used the distraction to bolt toward the door. He sprinted down the hallway, the sound of the guards shouting ringing in his ears. His heart hammered in his chest, and adrenaline surged through his veins as he pushed his body harder than he ever had before. Behind him, the guard was calling for backup. Jack's mind raced. He had no choice but to get out. Fast. He rounded a corner, nearly colliding with Caroline as she rushed toward him, wide-eyed and frantic. "Go! Go!" she shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him down another corridor. The two of them ran in silence, their footsteps echoing through the courthouse. Jack's lungs burned, but he kept going, adrenaline coursing through him, driving him forward. They reached the back exit, where a waiting vehicle was parked. Caroline shoved him into the car, and in a blur of motion, they were speeding away from the courthouse. Jack leaned back against the seat, breathing heavily. He could feel the weight of the documents in his hands, the weight of his future. He wasn't out of danger yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The world outside the car windows blurred in a cascade of neon lights and street lamps, the city racing past as if unaware of the storm that was brewing. Jack's pulse was still hammering in his chest, but he couldn't let himself relax, not yet. Every passing second felt like it might be his last. The file, still clutched tightly in his hand, was the key to his freedom. Or maybe it was his damnation. He didn't know what Masters would do if he found out what Jack had uncovered, but he had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be pretty. The man had been playing the game for far too long to let some upstart convict bring him down. The car sped through empty streets, and Caroline's eyes flickered nervously between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "We've got to lay low," she said, her voice tight with concern. "There's no telling how long it'll take before Masters realizes the file's gone." Jack nodded, trying to think clearly through the fog of adrenaline. "I need to get this to Laura. She's the one who can use it." Caroline turned to look at him. And you trust her? You think she can get it to the right people? Jack's eyes narrowed as he met her gaze. I do. I have to. Caroline didn't respond immediately. She kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but Jack could see the doubt creeping into her expression. I hope you're right, she muttered under her breath. They drove in silence for a while, the tension thick enough to cut through. Jack's mind raced, running through everything he knew and everything that had happened in the last few days. He was close, but how close was he really? The truth about Masters was in his hands, but getting it to the right people wasn't as simple as walking into a police station. There were far too many layers of corruption, too many people in powerful positions who would stop at nothing to protect their own. He glanced at the file again, the name, Masters, still glaring at him from the cover sheet. Inside, the truth was laid bare, documents, emails, and testimonies that could destroy the man's career, and possibly his life. But Jack had to remember one thing, Masters had power. And power didn't fall without a fight. We need to be careful, Jack said, his voice low and steady. If Masters finds out what we've got, we'll be dead before we get a chance to use it. Caroline gave a sharp nod. You're not wrong. That's why we can't just hand it over to anyone. We need to get it to someone who can protect it, someone with enough weight to take him down. Someone like Laura, Jack said, more to himself than to her. He didn't know what he would do without Laura. She had been the one to reach out, the one who believed in him when no one else did. She had risked everything for him, and now, it was his turn to do the same for her. As they neared a quiet, unmarked building on the outskirts of the city, Caroline pulled the car to a stop. She didn't turn off the engine immediately but kept her eyes trained on the street, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Is this it? Jack asked, his voice filled with apprehension. Caroline nodded, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. It's safe. I know this place. It's one of the only spots in the city that's off the grid. We can lay low for a while and figure out our next move. Jack hesitated, his eyes flicking back to the file in his hand. We don't have much time. We need to get this to Laura. Now. Caroline sighed and finally turned off the engine. You're right. But rushing in isn't the way. We need to plan this out carefully. We can't just hand it to her and expect everything to work out. I know, Jack said, his voice hardening with determination. But I don't have any other choice. She's the only one who can help me make this right. They exited the car, and Caroline led him through a back door into the building. It was dark and musty inside, the air thick with the scent of mildew and old paper. But there was something reassuring about it, a sense of safety, of hiding from the world outside. Inside, Caroline moved to a desk cluttered with papers, a few unmarked boxes, and a lone lamp flickering dimly. She picked up a phone and dialed a number quickly, her fingers trembling slightly. Laura, Caroline said into the receiver, her voice low but urgent. It's Caroline. I've got him. We've got the file. Jack stood back, pacing the small room as Caroline spoke in hushed tones, too far away for him to hear the conversation clearly. But every word that came from Caroline's lips only deepened his sense of urgency. Time was slipping away, and Jack was no longer in control of how the situation would unfold. Finally, Caroline turned to him and gave a quick nod. She wants to meet. She says there's a safe spot we can get to, but we need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that someone will catch on. Jack didn't hesitate. Let's go. As they left the building and climbed back into the car, Jack couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone was watching them. He glanced at the rearview mirror, scanning the street for any sign of danger, but everything appeared quiet. The streets were nearly empty, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional passing car. Caroline drove quickly, making sharp turns as they navigated the darkened streets. Every now and then, Jack caught a glimpse of a shadow darting between buildings or a figure slipping in and out of view. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He could feel the danger creeping in, closing in around him like a tightening noose. Minutes felt like hours, and Jack's pulse never slowed. He kept the file close, hidden beneath his coat, as if the slightest exposure would alert the wrong people. Caroline's eyes flicked to him from time to time, her expression one of quiet anxiety. She knew how high the stakes were, and she wasn't sure who she could trust in this game anymore. They finally arrived at a small, unassuming building tucked between two others. The area was quiet, tucked away in a part of the city that Jack had never seen before. Caroline parked the car in the back, and they made their way to the front entrance. As they walked in, Jack's mind raced. This was it. The final step. The chance to change everything. But even as he walked toward the meeting, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Somewhere, just out of sight, there was someone watching them. He had no proof, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. He pushed the thought aside. There was no time for doubts now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The dim glow of the building's lights illuminated the narrow hallway as Jack and Caroline stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Jack's heart was still racing, the adrenaline from the escape still coursing through his veins. But now, standing at the threshold of what could either be salvation or another trap, he felt a deep unease settle in the pit of his stomach. They walked past several doors, each seemingly leading into another world, one that was filled with shadows, secrets, and whispers. The air in the building smelled of stale paper and unspoken history, a place where nothing was as it seemed. Jack couldn't help but wonder how many others had passed through this building, each with their own stories, their own lives teetering on the edge of something unknown. But tonight, it was his life, and the truth about Masters, that would take center stage. Caroline led the way, her pace quick and purposeful. She seemed calm, composed, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands twitched, as if she was fighting an internal battle. He knew she was just as aware of the stakes as he was. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hallway. Caroline stopped and knocked twice, a sharp rhythm that echoed in the otherwise silent building. "Come in," came a voice from inside, a voice that Jack recognized immediately. It was Laura. Caroline pushed the door open and stepped aside, allowing Jack to enter first. As he walked into the room, his eyes immediately landed on Laura. She was standing by a desk, her arms crossed, a look of quiet determination on her face. Despite the tension, there was something about her that made Jack feel like he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Laura was dressed in a dark coat and slacks, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She looked professional, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a fire that burned quietly beneath her calm exterior. She had always been the type of person to keep her emotions in check, but Jack knew better than to underestimate her resolve. "Jack," she greeted him with a nod, her gaze flicking down to the file in his hands. "I see you've got it." He stepped forward, the weight of the file feeling heavier with each passing second. "I've got it," he said, his voice steady, though inside, he was a storm of uncertainty and fear. "But I don't think you realize how much danger we're in right now. Masters knows that something's gone wrong, and he's going to come after us." Laura nodded, her expression unchanged. "I know. That's why we need to act quickly." She motioned for Jack to sit at the table across from her, and he complied, placing the file carefully between them. Caroline lingered near the door, her eyes darting nervously as if she were ready to bolt at any moment. Jack understood. They weren't out of danger yet. Laura opened the file slowly, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. The more she read, the more her brow furrowed, and Jack couldn't help but notice the subtle tension building in her body. She wasn't just reading, it was like she was absorbing every word, every detail, weighing it all against what she knew. Finally, she closed the file, her eyes locking onto Jack's. This is huge, Jack. If this is true, it could bring down Masters. But it's not just his career on the line. This goes deeper. We're talking about powerful people, politicians, businessmen, people who will stop at nothing to protect themselves. Jack leaned forward, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. I know, he replied quietly. But if we don't expose him now, nothing will ever change. I've been framed for a crime I didn't commit, and the truth about Masters has to come out. This is my only chance. Laura sighed, looking between Jack and Caroline. And you're sure this is what you want? Because once we do this, there's no turning back. Once Masters knows, he'll come after you, and everyone around you. I don't have a choice, Jack said, his voice firm. I've already lost everything. I'm not going to let him get away with it. Not after everything he's done. Caroline stepped forward, her voice sharp. We're not just talking about the crime he committed. We're talking about the people he's controlled, the lives he's ruined. If we expose this, it's going to make waves. People are going to pay for their sins. Laura nodded slowly. I get that. But we can't expose this just yet. We need to gather more evidence. There's no way we're going to take him down with just a few documents. We need more. Jack's stomach tightened. What are you suggesting? We wait? We don't have the luxury of waiting, Laura replied. But we need a strategy. We can't just go to the police and hand them this file. It's too dangerous. Masters has eyes everywhere. If we want to make sure this sticks, we need to find allies who can help us. Jack's mind raced. Allies. Who could they trust? He thought of the people he'd known in the past, but most of them were either gone or had been corrupted by Masters' influence. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how isolated he really was. We need someone in a position of power, Laura continued, her voice low. Someone who can protect us while we go after Masters. A safe house, maybe. A journalist with the right connections. We can't expose him without some kind of protection, or it'll all go to hell. Jack glanced at Caroline, whose expression had shifted from nervous to resolute. You think this is possible? Caroline didn't hesitate. It's our only shot. We find the right people, and we'll have a chance to make this right. Laura stood up from the table and walked toward a map pinned on the wall. She traced her finger along a set of locations, places Jack recognized, places tied to the city's political and business elite. We'll start here, she said, tapping a spot on the map. I have a contact who owes me a favor. If anyone can help us get to the right people, it's them. Jack nodded, the plan starting to form in his mind. Then let's go. We don't have time to waste. Laura turned to Caroline. Stay here and keep the car running. We'll need to move quickly. If anything goes wrong, we'll use the escape route I've set up. The three of them exchanged one last glance before heading out the door, the weight of the world on their shoulders. As they made their way to the car, Jack's mind whirled with possibilities. This was their moment, the one shot they had to take down a man who had ruined countless lives. But Jack also knew that no matter how careful they were, danger was always a step behind them. And soon, it would catch up. The city was asleep, or at least, it looked that way. The streets were quieter now, as if the night itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Jack sat in the back of the car, eyes darting between the shadows of the buildings they passed, his mind racing. They were headed deeper into enemy territory. Caroline was behind the wheel, her grip on the steering wheel tight, her knuckles pale in the dim light. Laura sat beside Jack, her face unreadable, a quiet storm brewing in her eyes. She had a plan, but Jack knew from experience that plans often went sideways. And tonight, the stakes were higher than ever. This is it, Caroline said, her voice low, almost to herself as they turned onto a darkened street lined with imposing buildings. The kind that looked both luxurious and foreboding, perfect for someone like Thomas Masters. Jack felt his chest tighten as they neared their destination. Laura had remained silent since they left the safe house. She had been giving instructions in a clipped, no-nonsense manner, but her body language told a different story. She was anxious. Jack could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers kept tapping against her leg as if trying to keep herself composed. He understood the feeling all too well. They were walking straight into the lion's den, there was no other way to put it. If their contact didn't come through, if this was some sort of setup, they'd be caught in the middle of a trap with no way out. They reached the building, a sleek, modern structure that screamed wealth and power. The lights from the lobby seemed too bright, too sterile, like something straight out of a corporate movie set. They parked in a dark alley nearby, out of view from the cameras lining the entrance. "We go in, we get the information, and we get out," Laura said firmly, breaking the silence. "No distractions. No detours. If anyone even looks at us the wrong way, we walk." Caroline turned off the engine and exchanged a quick look with Jack before getting out of the car. They followed Laura as she led them toward the building, her steps measured, confident. Jack couldn't help but wonder if she was as nervous as he was or if she was hiding it behind that icy exterior of hers. They entered through a side door, a door that seemed too unremarkable for such an important place. It was almost as if they were entering a secret world, one where nothing was ever what it appeared. The hallway inside was pristine, gleaming with cold marble floors and walls lined with expensive artwork. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and wealth. "This way," Laura said, her voice calm but her eyes scanning every corner as if searching for threats. They followed her through a series of corridors until they reached an elevator. She pressed the button to the top floor, and they waited in silence, the hum of the elevator the only sound filling the space between them. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a view of the city that took Jack's breath away. The room they entered was large, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city lights below. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful. But Jack didn't trust beauty, not here. Not with everything on the line. A man was sitting behind a sleek desk, his back to them, staring out the windows. His silhouette was tall, broad-shouldered, the picture of confidence and power. He turned as they entered, a smile playing on his lips. "Laura," he greeted her coolly. "I wasn't sure you'd show up." Laura didn't return the smile. She walked past him, setting the file she had brought with her down on the table in front of him. "We need your help," she said without preamble. "This is bigger than any of us. We have information on Masters, and we need you to help us get it to the right people." The man stood slowly, his eyes scanning Jack and Caroline with careful interest. Jack immediately recognized him, the way he carried himself, the subtle power in his movements. He was someone who had been around power for a long time. "You've got the file?" The man's voice was low, calculating, and Jack felt an odd chill settle into his bones as the man walked closer to the table. Jack didn't say anything, but Laura nodded. "We need to get this out of the city. Masters has eyes everywhere. We can't just walk into a station and hand it over. We need someone with enough weight to protect us from him." The man, whose name Jack didn't yet know, looked down at the file, his expression unreadable. "What's in it for me?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Laura didn't hesitate. "The same thing that's in it for you every time, money. Power. The chance to deal a blow to someone who's been playing this city for too long. You know the stakes, and you know you can't afford to stay on the sidelines." The man's smile faltered slightly, and for the first time, Jack saw something like hesitation in his eyes. But it lasted only a moment before he regained his composure. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." Laura stepped closer, lowering her voice. "We don't have time for games. If you want to keep your position in this city, you'll help us. If not, you'll have a target on your back just like the rest of us." For a moment, there was a tense silence in the room. Jack could feel the weight of the situation hanging heavily on the air. He was acutely aware of the man's gaze on him now, studying him as if calculating the risk of aligning with them. Finally, he nodded, his face darkening. "All right," he said. "But I'm not doing this for free. You'll owe me. And you'll owe me big." Laura didn't flinch. "Fine. We can work that out later. But for now, we need your help. Are you in or out?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the window, staring out over the city, his back once again to them. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I'll help you," he said slowly. "But the moment this gets out, there's no turning back. You'll have the full weight of the city's elite coming after you. You understand that?" Jack nodded. "We understand." Laura stepped forward, placing the file in front of him. Then it settled. As the man took the file into his hands, Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. They were in this now, there was no going back. But at least for the moment, they had an ally. The real battle was just beginning. The air outside was heavy, thick with the promise of rain, but Jack could feel a different kind of storm brewing inside him. They had their ally, well, for now, but nothing about the situation felt secure. He had always known that in their line of work, trust was a luxury, and alliances were often more like temporary truce agreements than anything resembling loyalty. The man they'd met tonight, whoever he was, had his own agenda, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their bargaining had been less about helping them and more about securing his own future. As they stepped out of the building, Caroline gave Jack a quick glance. Her expression was tense, her eyes scanning the area as she pulled the collar of her coat up against the chill. She looked ready to bolt at a moment's notice. Jack could hardly blame her, the night had felt like walking a tightrope, with no safety net below. They were in a city of giants, dangerous, shadowy figures who would stop at nothing to protect their own. Laura, for her part, didn't seem fazed. She had a cool, almost detached air about her. But Jack knew better. Behind that composed exterior, there were layers of sharp intelligence, and perhaps a deeper, darker fear that she kept buried under all of it. "Where now?" Caroline asked, her voice tight as she reached for the keys to the car. "Do we trust him? Do we just walk away and leave him to figure out how to deal with Masters?" Laura didn't answer right away. She stood, her gaze lingering on the man's building as it faded into the night, then turned to face Jack and Caroline. "For now, yes. We trust him. But that doesn't mean we relax. He'll be watched. We'll be watched." The car ride back to the safe house was a quiet one. The only sound was the occasional hum of the engine as the city passed them by in a blur of lights and darkened streets. The threat of Masters loomed large in Jack's mind, more real than ever. But now, there was something else, a small spark of hope, however fleeting. They had made a critical move tonight, but the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. The drive seemed to take longer than usual, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. When they finally pulled into the garage beneath the safe house, Jack had half a mind to just sleep through the whole thing, shut his eyes and wake up when the storm had passed. But deep down, he knew that was a luxury he couldn't afford. The weight of the file, the information they had acquired, was still heavy in his hands, though he had passed it to Laura for safekeeping. If anyone could decipher the tangled mess of evidence inside, it was her. She had connections that stretched far beyond their immediate circle, ones that reached into places most people would only dream of. But they needed to act quickly. They couldn't afford to let the trail go cold. As they entered the safe house, Jack felt the usual sense of unease that came with being in one of these places built on secrets and paranoia. This wasn't home, not even close. But for now, it was a refuge, and that had to be enough. Laura immediately went to the table, spreading the file out in front of them. The dim light from the overhead lamp illuminated the contents, casting sharp shadows across the pages. Jack watched as she sifted through them, her fingers moving quickly, scanning each document, each piece of evidence. There was no hesitation in her movements, no second-guessing. This was her element, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt the smallest flicker of hope. "This is bigger than I thought," Laura said, her voice low. "Masters didn't just manipulate the system, he built it. Every step he took, every decision he made was calculated, every person he brought into the fold was a piece of his plan." Jack leaned in, studying the papers she had spread out. There were emails, financial records, photographs of meetings he'd never known about. It was like piecing together a puzzle, but instead of a picture of the past, they were looking at the framework of a network that was still very much alive. And it wasn't just Masters at the center of it, there were names here, names that made Jack's stomach churn with recognition. "They're all connected," Jack muttered, his mind racing. "I knew he was powerful, but this is something else. These people have been pulling the strings for years. Maybe decades." Laura didn't look up as she continued to sift through the documents. "This isn't just about Masters anymore. This is about dismantling the entire operation. The people he's working with, the people who've been complicit, they all need to be exposed. If we don't take them down together, this cycle will never end." "Then we need more," Caroline spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "More evidence, more names. We can't just go to the police with a file and expect them to take down a whole network like this." Laura nodded. "Exactly. We need leverage. Allies who can vouch for the information we have. People who have the power to make this stick. Otherwise, it'll be swept under the rug before we even have a chance to blink." Jack felt his stomach twist as the weight of what she was saying settled in. They were at the beginning of something massive, something that could bring down not just Masters, but a whole system that had been thriving in the shadows. They were playing with fire, and there was no telling how close they were to being burned. "We need to move quickly," Jack said, his voice firm. "We get the next batch of evidence, and we take it straight to the people who can help us. The longer we wait, the more time Masters has to cover his tracks, to find us." Laura met his gaze, her eyes intense, calculating. "I know. But we need to be careful. We can't just trust anyone. Not yet." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of their situation settling over them like a heavy fog. Jack felt the pressure of the plan they had to execute, the stakes that were climbing higher with each passing hour. There was no room for mistakes. If they faltered now, it would all be over. And then, a thought hit him. Sharp and sudden. "Laura," Jack said, his voice low with realization. "How do you know that guy? The one who gave us the chance to get the evidence." Laura's eyes flickered, and she immediately glanced at Caroline, as if debating whether to answer the question. Finally, she met Jack's gaze. "Let's just say," she said slowly, "I've crossed paths with him before. And I'll leave it at that." Jack wasn't satisfied with that answer, but he knew better than to push. Not yet. They were all in this together, but some secrets needed to stay buried for the time being. With a deep breath, Jack stood up. "We need to make our next move. Let's not waste any more time." They were all in agreement, but the question lingered. How long could they keep running in the dark, pulling strings, making deals, before Masters and his network found them? The clock was ticking. The sun had barely risen, but the safe house felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension. Jack had barely slept the night before, the events unfolding in rapid succession too much for his mind to process. He had never been one to shy away from danger, but now, with everything at stake, his every instinct was on high alert. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. Caroline was already up when he entered the small kitchen, sipping her coffee in silence. Her gaze flicked up as Jack walked in, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she studied him, almost as if weighing whether to ask the questions that were clearly on her mind. Jack didn't blame her. They were all walking a razor's edge, and the slightest wrong move could send them tumbling down. "You're up early," Jack said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He hadn't asked for it, but the thought of the bitter liquid was somehow grounding, a small piece of normalcy in the chaos. "Couldn't sleep," Caroline replied, her voice tired but steady. "You're thinking about Masters, aren't you?" Jack paused, the cup halfway to his lips. "You could say that." Her expression darkened. "What's your gut telling you?" He set the cup down, his hands shaking slightly. "I don't trust our new friend. The man we met last night. Something's off. He knows more than he's letting on. And I have a feeling that once we get what we need from him, we'll be disposable." Caroline leaned back in her chair, the lines of worry on her face deepening. "You're not wrong. There's something too clean about all of this. Why help us? Why now? It doesn't add up." Before Jack could respond, Laura entered the kitchen. She had the same cool, controlled expression she always wore, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of concern, just enough to make Jack pause. "Everything okay?" Laura asked, glancing at both of them. Caroline nodded, but Jack could see the worry still lingering beneath the surface. "Just thinking," he said, his voice low. "We don't know who to trust anymore. We need to be ready for anything." Laura's gaze hardened, and she straightened up, crossing her arms over her chest. "Agreed. And we'll have to move faster than we planned. The longer we wait, the more chances Masters has to close his net around us." Jack nodded, his stomach tightening. "What's the next step, then?" Laura pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen. "We'll meet our contact tomorrow. I've arranged for a secure drop of the next batch of information. But there's a catch." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "The contact is in a position of power. Someone who's worked with Masters in the past. This could be the break we need, or it could be a trap." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "A trap? You didn't tell us it might be a trap. Why the hell would you risk something like that?" "Because we don't have a choice," Laura said, her voice unwavering. "We either take the risk, or we lose everything. We can't afford to hesitate now." Jack stood up, the adrenaline beginning to pump through his veins as his mind started working through the possibilities. "When do we move?" "Tonight," Laura replied. "We need to be ready before anyone can tip off Masters. And remember, we're not just getting information, we're going in with a target on our backs. We move fast, hit hard, and get out clean." Caroline sighed, but there was a resigned acceptance in her eyes. "Let's just make sure we don't walk straight into a setup." With that, the plans were made. Jack didn't like the idea of walking into a situation where they might be trapped, but he also knew that they didn't have the luxury of waiting. Masters was powerful, but they had the one thing he didn't. An inside track. If they could keep moving fast enough, they might just be able to dismantle the Empire before it could crush them. The day was spent preparing, checking and double-checking everything they would need for the mission ahead. The safe house, once a place of cautious comfort, now felt like a temporary holding pen, an unwelcome interlude before the next phase of their battle. As the sky outside darkened, the tension only grew. Jack found himself pacing the small room, his mind racing with too many questions. What if they were walking straight into a trap? What if the man they had met last night had played them from the very beginning? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting to pounce. "We'll be fine," Caroline said, almost as if reading his mind. She looked up from the gear she was packing, her eyes steady and reassuring. "We've been in worse situations before. We'll get through this." Jack wanted to believe her, but the nagging doubt in his gut refused to let go. "I hope you're right," he said, but the words felt hollow, unconvincing. The night passed slowly, each second stretching longer than the last as they finalized their plans. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this restless. He knew that tomorrow, tonight, rather, could change everything. By the time they were ready to move, the streets were quiet, the city bathed in a dull, orange glow from the streetlights. Their car was waiting in the garage, and it felt like the beginning of something monumental. Laura was the first to climb into the driver's seat, and they all settled into their respective positions. Jack and Caroline in the back, Laura in the front, her eyes focused on the road ahead. "Just remember," Laura said, her voice calm but steely, "no matter what happens tonight, we stay in control. This isn't just about getting the information. It's about making sure Masters doesn't walk away unscathed. We bring him down for good, or we don't walk out of this." The car pulled out of the garage, and Jack glanced back at the safe house as it disappeared behind them. He wasn't sure what awaited them, but he was certain of one thing: there was no turning back now. The drive through the city felt endless, even though the distance wasn't that far. Jack's thoughts were a whirlwind, each one more disorienting than the last. He couldn't help but replay the events of the previous day over and over in his mind, trying to find a clue, a hint, something that could tell him what was really going on. Laura's voice broke through the silence, sharp and direct, as she guided the car through a maze of darkened streets. "We're close," she said, her gaze scanning the rearview mirror and the empty roads ahead. "Stay sharp. No matter what happens, stay in your role. This is our shot, and we can't blow it." Caroline's voice was low, but there was a tension in it that reflected Jack's own. "Do you really think this is going to work? The contact, they've been involved with Masters before. How do we know they won't just sell us out?" "I don't trust anyone fully," Laura replied without hesitation. "But if we play our cards right, we'll get what we need. We'll get out fast." They were just a few blocks from the location, a nondescript office building in a rundown part of the city that Jack had never visited. The whole area had the feel of a forgotten neighborhood, abandoned storefronts, broken streetlights, graffiti-covered walls. It didn't look like a place where anything significant would happen. Jack felt his pulse quicken, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a calculated risk. Laura slowed the car and took a sharp turn into a narrow alleyway that led directly to a hidden door at the back of the building. She parked the car in the shadows, leaving the engine running. They sat there for a moment, the hum of the engine filling the silence as Jack's thoughts spiraled. "You ready?" Laura asked, her eyes fixed on the building ahead. Jack didn't answer immediately. His gaze locked on the dark windows of the building. The moment they stepped out of the car, they would be exposed. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "Let's do it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They exited the car one by one, moving swiftly and without a word. Jack's mind raced with every step. They approached the back door and Laura knocked twice, quick, rhythmic taps that seemed almost absurdly quiet given the tension in the air. After a long moment, the door creaked open just enough for a face to peek out. It was a man Jack didn't recognize. Early 40s, with a face that was weathered by experience but still handsome in a way that betrayed no obvious allegiance. The kind of man who could blend into a crowd and be forgotten the second he left it. "You're late," the man said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Traffic," Laura replied curtly, before stepping forward and handing over a small envelope. "The exchange." The man's eyes flicked from the envelope to Laura, sizing her up before nodding. "Come in." They filed into a dimly lit hallway, the smell of stale air and old wood filling Jack's nose. The building looked even worse on the inside, as if it hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. Without a word, the man led them down the hall, opening another door that revealed a small office. At a desk sat another man, older, with a stern, calculating look. Jack could see immediately that this wasn't someone they could underestimate. "Sit," the older man said, motioning to the chairs across from him. They took their seats in silence. Jack's heart was pounding now. Every instinct told him to be on high alert, but he fought to maintain composure. He couldn't afford to show weakness. The man at the desk studied them, his gaze cold and penetrating. You're the ones who think you can bring down masters, he said finally, his voice slow, measured. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. He didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch between them. The last thing they needed was to reveal too much before they were sure of the man's intentions. Yes, Laura answered for them, her voice calm and unwavering. That's why we're here. We have the information. We need your help. The man's lips twitched, almost like a smirk, but there was no warmth in it. And what makes you think I'm interested in helping you? You're walking into a minefield. And if you're not careful, you'll end up as casualties in a war that's been going on far longer than you realize. Your loyalties to masters, isn't it? Jack cut in, leaning forward in his chair. You don't need to pretend. We know who you are. The older man's eyes narrowed. You think you're in control here? I'm the one who's been running this game long before you even knew it existed. You're just players, small players. There it was. The first sign that something wasn't right. Jack exchanged a quick glance with Caroline, who gave him a slight shake of her head. The tension in the room had shifted, it was no longer a simple exchange. This was something else entirely. The older man continued, his voice low, if you want to bring down masters, you'll have to make a choice. Do you want the truth? Or do you want power? Jack's pulse quickened. The choice was clear, the truth could give them everything they needed, but it could also expose them to an even greater danger. Power was tempting, but it would come at a cost they weren't sure they could pay. I'm listening, Jack said slowly, his voice almost a whisper. The man's gaze flicked to the side, and for a brief moment, Jack saw something, a flash of fear. Regret? He couldn't quite tell. But it was there, and it made his gut twist with unease. You'll need to do something for me, the man said, standing up and walking over to a nearby filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick file and tossed it onto the desk. Take this. It's the next step in your journey. But be warned, it's not what you think. Before Jack could reach for the file, the man's hand shot out, stopping him. Once you take this, there's no going back. You'll either have the power to take down masters, or you'll be his next victim. Jack hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Power? Truth? Both? The man's words were like a warning bell in his head, but he knew that in this game, hesitation meant death. He reached out and grabbed the file. As soon as his fingers touched the folder, the door slammed open behind them, and a group of armed men stormed into the room. It was a trap. The world seemed to slow down as the door crashed open, the sound echoing through the dimly lit office. Jack's hand instinctively clenched around the file, his heart hammering in his chest. He could see the guns, some of them pointing directly at him and the others, sweeping the room like the cold gaze of death. The betrayal was so sudden, so calculated, it left no room for hesitation. Caroline's eyes widened in shock, but there was no time for panic. Laura, always the professional, was already moving, her body tensing like a coiled spring, ready for action. Jack could hear the soft click of a gun being cocked, and then he saw it, one of the men from the group smirking at them. The smug look told him everything he needed to know. They had walked straight into a trap. Did you really think you could trust anyone? The older man asked from behind his desk, his voice laced with venom. He was still standing, calm as ever, but Jack saw the glint in his eyes, the one that said everything had gone according to plan. Did you think I was just some small-time player, that I didn't have eyes everywhere? Jack's pulse raced, but he kept his expression neutral, his mind already spinning with options. He knew better than to trust anyone in this world, but he had underestimated just how far this man would go. They weren't dealing with an ordinary criminal here, they were up against a mastermind who had orchestrated everything from the beginning. This wasn't just a simple exchange gone wrong. This was a full-blown betrayal. I should have known, Jack muttered under his breath, not breaking eye contact with the man. The weight of their situation began to settle in, the reality of it sinking deep into his bones. They were outnumbered, trapped in a room with no exit. Caroline was already pulling out her gun, her movements swift and calculated. She had no choice now but to fight her way out. Jack could see her fingers tighten around the grip, her eyes locked on the men who had surrounded them. "Get the file," the older man ordered, his tone cold. "And make sure they don't leave alive." Without missing a beat, one of the armed men lunged for the file Jack was still clutching. Jack reacted immediately, instinctively moving to protect the only thing that could give them a chance to get out of this alive. He shoved the file into his jacket, but before he could fully conceal it, a sharp pain shot through his side. One of the men had grazed him with a bullet. His body jerked from the impact, but his reflexes kicked in. He dove for the nearest cover, behind a large filing cabinet, dragging Caroline with him as she fired back. "Cover us!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse but commanding. Laura, who had taken the worst of the surprise, was already on the move, diving behind a desk for cover. Her gunfire echoed through the small room, loud and precise, but the odds were stacked against them. The armed men advanced slowly, their tactics meticulous and controlled. "Get out of the way!" Caroline shouted, pushing Jack aside just as another bullet whizzed past them. The air was thick with tension and the sharp staccato of gunfire. Jack's head spun, his thoughts whirling in a mix of adrenaline and pain. His hand instinctively reached for his wound, but he couldn't focus on it now. He needed to think fast. This was their only shot at survival, and the truth in that file could change everything. Through the haze of gunfire, Jack caught a glimpse of the older man, who was still standing behind his desk, completely unfazed by the chaos. He was watching them, waiting for them to make their move. The sudden realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut: they were never meant to leave this room alive. This entire situation had been set up from the start. The file wasn't just information, it was a death sentence. The fire from the enemy grew more intense, and Jack could feel the pressure mounting. They were being herded like cattle, with nowhere to go. But Jack refused to accept that this was how it was going to end. "Laura, the exit!" Jack shouted, his mind racing. "We need to get to the back door." Laura didn't need to be told twice. She was already moving, giving Caroline and Jack enough time to reposition. The three of them moved together, trying to make it to the exit, fighting back as best they could, but the men had anticipated this. The closer they got, the more fire they took. Jack felt the sting of another bullet, this time in his arm, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. There was no choice now. They had to survive. "Go!" Jack barked, his voice strained as they reached the door. Laura was the first to burst through, her gun raised in front of her. Caroline and Jack followed closely behind, Jack's body screaming in pain from the multiple wounds. But they couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. They ran down the hallway, their footsteps loud and frantic. The sound of their pursuers closing in only spurred them on. Jack could hear shouting behind them, the telltale signs of a man who wasn't used to losing control. Master's people were closing in fast, but they had a head start. "We need a car," Caroline shouted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Now." At the end of the hall, they found a small staircase leading down into a darkened parking garage. The sound of their pursuers' footsteps was getting closer, and Jack's mind was racing through the possibilities. A car was their only chance at escape. They sprinted down the stairs, and to their relief, there was a car parked at the far end of the garage. Laura quickly moved toward it, unlocking the door. But as soon as the door clicked open, a series of gunshots rang out, hitting the concrete near their feet. They dove into the car, slamming the doors shut just as the barrage of bullets hit the side of the vehicle. "Go!" Jack shouted, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. Laura threw the car into reverse, slamming her foot on the gas. The tires screeched as they sped away, the sound of pursuit fading into the night. They had made it out, but Jack knew this was far from over. The betrayal had cut deep, and now, they were more exposed than ever before. Masters wasn't just a man, they were up against an entire system. But they couldn't stop. Not when they were so close. As the city lights flickered past, Jack's mind returned to the file clutched tightly in his hands. The truth was inside it. And now, he would stop at nothing to make sure it was exposed. The car's engine roared as they raced down the city streets, the darkness swallowing them whole. Jack's side burned, and his arm ached, but the adrenaline rushing through his veins kept him moving. His heart was still pounding from the chaos they just barely escaped, but there was no time to rest, not yet. Not until the truth was out, until Masters was exposed. Laura gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her eyes flicking from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. She knew they couldn't stay on the streets for much longer. Even though they'd escaped the immediate danger, they were still being hunted. The moment they hit the open road, the gunman would be after them, and they wouldn't stop until the job was finished. Caroline, her face pale but resolute, stared out the window, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Jack could sense her unease. They were all thinking the same thing. They had the file, but they didn't know what it contained yet. And if they couldn't decipher it in time, they wouldn't just be risking their lives, they'd be risking the lives of everyone who depended on them. How long until we can go over the file? Caroline asked, her voice tight, strained with the weight of what had just happened. Jack, leaning back against the seat with his hand pressed against his side, tried to steady his breathing. We'll need a secure place to do it. Somewhere safe. Not here. His gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. And we need to lose the tail first. The last thing we need is to be cornered again. Laura nodded, quick and efficient as always. I've got a place. It's off the grid, no one knows about it. Just hold tight. As they sped through the night, Jack's mind raced. He had seen what Masters was capable of, but the more he thought about it, the less he understood. Whoever had orchestrated the attack, whoever had set them up, was playing a much bigger game than they had anticipated. The older man at the office had made it clear, they were stepping into something far darker than they had ever realized. And yet, Jack couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were being manipulated. The file was too important, too central to everything. The information inside could bring down an empire, but what if it was a trap? What if the whole thing was designed to pull them deeper into the web of lies? Do you think they knew we were coming? Caroline's voice cut through his thoughts. Jack didn't answer immediately, but his mind churned. They had known they were walking into a trap. The older man had made it obvious. It was clear they'd been tracked, watched long before they stepped foot into that office. The real question was, why had they been allowed to escape? I think we're part of a bigger plan, Jack said finally. His voice was steady, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed the truth. We've been played, Caroline. But right now, it's too late to back out. We've got the file, and we need to find out what's inside. Everything hinges on it. Laura glanced at him, a flicker of worry in her otherwise unreadable expression. And what if what's inside isn't what we think? What if it's more dangerous than we imagined? Jack didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know what they were walking into. But there was no turning back now. They had started this, and they would finish it, no matter the cost. The next few miles felt like an eternity. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sharp breath from Caroline or Laura. Jack's mind continued to replay the events of the past few days, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together, just barely. The man who had betrayed them wasn't just any criminal. He was a part of a much larger network, a network that went beyond just Masters. If they were going to bring down the system, they had to start with this file. As Laura took a sharp turn onto a quiet, isolated road, Jack could feel the tension in his muscles begin to loosen. They were getting close to their safe house. He would have a chance to rest for a moment, just long enough to gather his thoughts and examine the file. Finally, the car slowed and pulled into an unmarked, secluded lot. The area was empty, no streetlights, no signs of life. It felt like they had slipped off the map, just the way Laura had promised. They parked behind a large building, one that looked like it hadn't seen any human activity in years. The windows were blacked out, and the door was a heavy, rusted thing that creaked when it opened. Once inside, they moved quickly, checking the place for any signs of surveillance. They had no idea who was watching, who was listening. Jack wasn't taking any chances. He locked the door behind them and glanced around the room. The space was small but comfortable, everything they needed, nothing more. They couldn't afford anything more right now. Laura made her way to the small kitchen and began preparing a few makeshift bandages for their wounds. She worked efficiently, not speaking, not needing to. Caroline sat at the small wooden table, eyes fixed on the file, still unopened. Jack took a deep breath and walked over, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. "Ready?" he asked, trying to steady his shaking hands. Caroline nodded, her expression determined. "Let's see what we're up against." He took the file, his fingers grazing over the worn edges. It was heavier than he expected. The paper inside was thick, old, and covered with a series of codes and dates. "Are you sure about this?" Laura asked, glancing up as she finished applying bandages to her side. Jack didn't answer. His fingers trembled as he flipped open the first page. The words inside were jumbled at first, a mix of codes and encrypted text that Jack couldn't immediately make sense of. But then something caught his eye, a name. James Masters. It was bold, printed across the top of a page in stark black ink. Jack's breath hitched. The name had been the thread they were chasing all along, the key to everything. But what did it mean? Why was Masters so central to all of this? What was the connection to the men who had tried to kill them? As he continued reading, the rest of the puzzle started to fit together, just enough to raise even more questions. "This isn't just about Masters," Jack murmured under his breath. "It's about something bigger. Something much bigger than we realized." The war was just beginning. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The weight of the file in Jack's hands felt heavier than ever. The names on the pages were unsettling, not just because they were tied to James Masters, but because they were connected to figures they had thought were allies, people Jack had once trusted, now implicated in a conspiracy that ran deeper than he could have ever imagined. The lines between friend and foe had blurred beyond recognition. Jack stared at the file for a long moment, his mind working through the connections, the implications. This was no longer just about Masters. It was about an entire network, an underground movement that had its roots in places Jack never thought to look. It stretched across continents, pulling strings, influencing governments, manipulating people in ways that Jack was only beginning to comprehend. Caroline broke the silence first. Her voice was steady, though there was a nervous edge to it. "So, what now? We have the file, but we don't exactly have a plan." She glanced around the room at the three of them, their faces weary and battered from their escape. "We don't have time to sit on this," Jack said, his voice strained with a mix of frustration and urgency. He set the file down on the table in front of him, flipping it open once again. His eyes skimmed over the documents, pausing at names, dates, and events that made his stomach churn. "We need to expose this, but we also need to be smart. We can't trust anyone, not even those we thought were on our side." Laura, who had been silently tending to her wounds, finally spoke up. Her eyes met Jack's with a hard, calculating gaze. "You're right. But exposing this isn't going to be easy. There are people in powerful positions, people who can make this all disappear in the blink of an eye." Jack nodded grimly, his mind racing. "Which means we need to find someone who's in a position to help us, but isn't compromised. Someone who can handle this without being bought off. And we need to get the truth out, before they come for us." He glanced at Caroline, who was already gathering her thoughts. We need to go public. The world needs to know what's happening, even if it means putting ourselves in more danger. Caroline nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. I agree. But we need a way to get this to the right people. A journalist, a politician, someone who can handle this without getting swept up by the system that Masters has in place. Jack leaned back in his chair, his hand still clutching the file. He felt the walls closing in. They were running out of time, and the deeper they went into this, the more it felt like they were chasing shadows. But they couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close. We'll need to be careful, Jack said, his tone growing more resolute. The people we trust, we don't know who we can trust anymore. Masters has eyes everywhere. For a moment, the three of them fell into a contemplative silence. The weight of their predicament was starting to hit them. They had been playing a dangerous game from the start, but now it was clear just how deep the rabbit hole went. The conspiracy was massive, and if they weren't careful, they'd be swallowed up by it before they even had a chance to make a difference. I think we need to go to someone on the inside, Laura said, breaking the silence. We need a contact who can get us information about Masters' network, someone who can tell us where we can hit them hardest. Jack looked at her, eyes narrowed in thought. Someone who knows the inner workings. A mole, maybe, or someone who has access to the right people without being a part of the system. Caroline tilted her head, her mind already working through the possibilities. I know someone. An old contact. He used to work for Masters' people, but he was one of the few who didn't get involved in the dirty stuff. He might be able to help us, but it's a risk. A big risk, Jack muttered. But it's the only shot we've got. We don't have time to be picky. Laura stood up, her posture straightening. I'll make contact. But we can't waste time. Every second we wait is another second they're out there hunting us. Jack looked at the two of them, the tension in the air palpable. They had come too far to back down now. They had been betrayed, almost killed, but they were still standing. And now they had something even more valuable, the truth. We'll meet him, Jack said, his voice firm. But we need to be prepared. If he's not the ally we think he is, we need to be ready to get out fast. Caroline gave a short nod. I'll make the arrangements. We'll meet him tonight. The hours leading up to the meeting felt like a lifetime. Jack's mind raced with all the possibilities. What if the contact was a trap? What if they were walking right into another ambush? But there was no time to second-guess themselves. They had come this far, and they had to take the risk. As night fell, they made their way to the agreed-upon location, an old, run-down bar on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was the perfect place for a secret meeting. The place was empty except for a few locals nursing their drinks at the counter, and the dim lighting provided the kind of privacy they needed. They didn't speak much as they approached the back table where their contact was supposed to be. Jack's hand rested on the gun at his hip, his eyes scanning the room. Caroline's expression was tight, her mind clearly on edge, while Laura remained the picture of calm professionalism, her eyes never leaving their surroundings. At the back of the bar, a figure sat alone, shrouded in shadow. As they drew closer, Jack could make out the familiar face, a man in his late 40s, with dark circles under his eyes, as if the weight of his past had finally caught up with him. It was Gregory Sinclair, a former associate of Masters, someone who had always managed to stay on the fringes, never fully embracing the darkness of the operation. Sinclair, Jack said, his voice low but steady. We need your help. Sinclair looked up, his tired eyes scanning the group before settling on Jack. A flicker of recognition passed through his face, followed by something darker, something Jack couldn't quite place. I don't know what you're getting yourselves into, Sinclair muttered, his voice rough. But if you want my help, it's going to cost you. Jack slid into the chair across from him, keeping his eyes locked on Sinclair's. We don't have time for games. We need information, and we need it now. Sinclair hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room as if making sure no one was listening. Then, with a long sigh, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. I can tell you what you need to know. But you have to understand something, Masters isn't just a man. He's a system. You take him down, you take down everything. Jack nodded slowly. We're ready. And with that, the real war began. The atmosphere in the bar grew heavier with every passing second. Jack could feel the weight of Sinclair's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. He had heard stories of the corruption that Masters had spread, how deep his influence reached, but hearing it from someone who had once been part of it felt like a jolt to his very core. Sinclair wasn't a whistleblower by nature, he was a survivor, someone who had kept his head down while the storm raged around him. But now, it seemed, the storm was coming for all of them. Sinclair leaned in, his eyes darting nervously to the door before speaking in a low, urgent whisper. Masters runs a global network, but what you need to understand is this, he's not just manipulating markets or orchestrating dirty deals. He's got people in high places. People who can make anything disappear. Entire investigations. Public opinion. Even people like you. Jack clenched his jaw, trying to digest the weight of the revelation. How far does it go? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Too far. Sinclair's eyes darted toward the bartender, who was cleaning glasses with a lack of interest. This isn't just a conspiracy. It's a business. And you think you've got a file full of information? There are a dozen more just like it, each one more dangerous than the last. This isn't just about exposing Masters, it's about dismantling a whole empire. You don't take him down without making powerful enemies. Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze sharp. So what do we do? Just sit here and wait for him to come after us? Do you have any idea how to beat him? Sinclair sighed, his hand shaking slightly as he took a drink from his glass. Beating him isn't something you can do without a plan. But I can give you the tools to make him sweat. If you want to survive long enough to bring him down, you need to go after his supply lines, his money, his people. And that means going deeper into the network. There's a safe house where they keep their most sensitive assets. I've been there once, but that was years ago. Now, it's a fortress. Jack's mind raced. A fortress? This was more than just a few dirty dealings, they were talking about a massive, well-guarded operation. And if they were going to destroy it, they would need access, information, and most importantly, the right people on their side. What's the safe house? Jack asked, his voice barely concealing the urgency in his tone. Sinclair hesitated before answering. It's not just any house. It's located on an old military base, locked down tighter than anything you've seen. But if you get in, you'll find everything you need to end this. Every document. Every connection. It's where they store their biggest secrets. How do we get in? Caroline asked, her voice sharp and focused. You'll need a key, Sinclair said, his voice low. The key is someone on the inside. Someone who can walk you through the door. That's where things get tricky. Jack leaned forward. Someone on the inside? Who? Sinclair looked around again, then nodded toward the back of the bar, signaling for them to follow. Not here. We need to get out before someone hears us. The three of them exchanged quick, uncertain glances, but they all understood the weight of the situation. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. They needed to move. Quickly. The group made their way out of the bar and into the chilly night air, stepping into the alleyway behind the building. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off the damp concrete. The weight of their next move was heavy in the air as Sinclair led them down the narrow path. Jack's senses were on high alert. Something about this felt too easy. You said we need someone on the inside, Jack prompted again, his voice low. Who do we need? Sinclair stopped, turning to face them, his eyes shadowed with doubt. Her name is Emma Granger. She's a former associate of Master's, worked closely with him for years. She knows the inner workings of everything they do, but she disappeared off the radar months ago. Last I heard, she was hiding out in the city. If anyone can get you inside, it's her. Where can we find her? Caroline asked, her voice sharp, already on the move. She's paranoid, Sinclair warned, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be listening. You can't just walk up to her and expect answers. But if you show her that you're serious, that you've got something to offer, she might help you. Jack considered the information for a moment, running through their options. If Emma Granger really had the access they needed, she could be their ticket to putting an end to everything. But convincing her to help wouldn't be easy. We'll find her, Jack said firmly. We'll do whatever it takes. Sinclair looked at them, his face hardening with an unreadable expression. You have no idea what you're getting into. But if you want to take down Masters, you'll need to be ready to go to the darkest corners of this world. People die for less. We're ready, Jack said, his voice unwavering. Sinclair nodded once, turning toward a nearby car parked along the curb. Then get in. I'll take you to where she's staying. But after that, you're on your own. You want to take him down? Then you better be prepared to lose everything. The weight of Sinclair's words hung in the air as they climbed into the car. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, there was no going back now. The city passed by in a blur, the neon lights of downtown flickering in the distance. The streets felt empty, desolate, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. They were getting closer to Emma Granger, closer to the heart of the operation. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Are you sure about this? Caroline asked, her voice laced with tension. We have no choice, Jack said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. This is our chance. Sinclair remained quiet as he drove, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. The closer they got to Emma, the closer they got to the fire. And once they stepped into that fire, there would be no telling what they'd have to burn to survive. The city streets blurred by in a cascade of neon lights and shadows, the dark alleyways of the urban landscape seeming to swallow the car as they pressed forward. Jack's mind raced with the weight of the task ahead. Every step they took toward Emma Granger's location felt like stepping deeper into the inferno. The closer they got to the heart of the operation, the more dangerous the game became. They were walking on a razor's edge, where one wrong move could spell the end. The tension in the car was palpable. Caroline was staring out of the window, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular but the dark streets passing by. Laura's jaw was clenched, her posture rigid as she glanced at the file they had brought with them. The documents were tucked safely under her arm, but the secrets they held felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. Sinclair remained quiet in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. His face was unreadable, but Jack could see the shadows of fear lurking in his eyes. He knew this path, he had walked it before. But now, he was leading them into the unknown, where every step could lead them to their deaths. How much further? Jack asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but the anxiety clawing at the back of his mind was becoming impossible to ignore. We're almost there, Sinclair replied, his voice low. Just a few more blocks. Jack nodded, eyes scanning the dark streets. The cold night air pressed against the windows, but the heat inside the car seemed to grow with each passing moment. They were nearing the location where Emma Granger was hiding, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every instinct in him told him to be cautious, to keep their guard up. There was no way they were the only ones looking for Emma. If Master's people were still hunting her, they would be closing in soon. I still don't like this, Caroline muttered, her eyes narrowing as she watched the road ahead. If she really has the access we need, why hasn't she made herself known by now? Why the secrecy? Jack sighed, his thoughts mirroring Caroline's concerns. Because she's smart, he said. She's been on the run for months. She knows what's at stake. Laura shifted in her seat, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings as they turned down a narrow, poorly lit street. If she's hiding out, then we need to be ready for anything. No matter how much access she has, she's not going to hand it over willingly. Sinclair took a sharp turn into a nearly deserted block, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The building they pulled up in front of was an old, run-down apartment complex. The kind of place you'd never expect to find someone important, or dangerous. But Jack knew better than to judge appearances. If Emma Granger was hiding here, it was because she knew it was the last place anyone would look. This is it, Sinclair said, pulling the car to a stop. He glanced around nervously before meeting Jack's eyes. Be careful. She's not a fan of company, especially not in situations like this. Jack nodded. Understood. Stay in the car. Caroline and Laura followed him as he stepped out of the car and approached the building. The door was locked, and the windows were dark, the whole place exuding an eerie silence. But Jack could feel the presence of something, or someone, waiting inside. Emma was here, and she was just as ready as they were to make this dangerous move. They knocked twice, a sharp, deliberate rap. The silence stretched on longer than Jack was comfortable with. Just when he was about to knock again, a small slot in the door slid open, and a pair of wary eyes peered through the darkness. "Who are you?" a voice asked, muffled but sharp. "We're not here to hurt you," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "We need your help. You're the only one who can get us inside the safe house." The eyes narrowed, the slot closing before Jack had a chance to react. There was a tense moment of silence before the door creaked open, revealing a tall, thin woman in her early 30s with sharp features and an intensity in her eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "Emma Granger?" Jack asked, his voice calm but demanding. She gave him a skeptical look. "Who wants to know?" "We don't have time for games," Caroline cut in. "We need your help, Emma. We're up against Masters, and we don't have a choice." Emma studied them for a long moment, her gaze flicking between Jack, Caroline, and Laura, before she let out a soft sigh. She opened the door wider and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Fine. Come in. But if this is some kind of setup, I won't hesitate to end it right here," she said, her voice low but laced with a warning. They stepped inside, the musty smell of old wood and stale air hitting them immediately. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with just a few pieces of furniture scattered haphazardly around the room. It was clear Emma had been living here for a while, but she hadn't bothered to make it comfortable. She had only one thing in mind: survival. "I don't trust you," she said once they were inside, her eyes lingering on them with an unreadable expression. "You come to me, asking for help, but I don't know you. And trust is in short supply these days." Jack wasn't surprised by her suspicion. He'd be wary too, especially if his life depended on staying hidden. But they didn't have time to waste. "We know you've worked with Masters," Jack said, his tone calm and direct. "We need access to the safe house. We have documents that can bring him down, but we need to get inside. You're the only one who knows how." Emma's eyes darkened at the mention of Masters' name, but she didn't flinch. She crossed her arms over her chest and leaned against the wall, studying them. "Why should I help you?" she asked. "You're not the first people to come to me for help. And I'm not in the business of helping people who don't understand the risk." "We understand the risk," Caroline said, her voice steady. "But we're not backing down. We want to take him down, and we need you to help us do it. If you can't help, then we're all dead anyway." For a moment, there was a tense silence as Emma considered her options. The weight of the situation hung heavy between them, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. "You really don't know what you're asking for, do you?" "Fine. I'll help. But it's going to cost you. And when we get in there, there's no going back. Jack didn't hesitate. We're ready. Emma nodded. Then let's get to work. As she began explaining the steps they needed to take, Jack felt the walls closing in even more. The game was getting more dangerous, and the stakes were higher than ever. But they had no choice now. They had come this far. There was no turning back. The next few hours would determine their fate. The apartment was silent except for the sound of Emma's steady breathing and the occasional scribbling of a pen on paper as she mapped out the steps they would need to take. She was meticulous, every detail carefully laid out. Jack watched her closely, trying to read her, wondering if she truly believed they could pull this off. The stakes had been set, and they were now standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down at the chaos they would soon unleash. "Do you have a plan?" Caroline asked, her voice low but laced with an edge of impatience. "Because we don't have forever." Emma stopped writing for a moment, her eyes lifting to meet Caroline's. Her expression was hard, calculating. "You think I've survived this long without a plan?" she replied coldly. She didn't wait for an answer before continuing. "We'll need to get into the safe house undetected, and that's not going to be easy. Masters has his eyes everywhere, and his people will be watching. Then we'll have to make them look the other way," Laura said, her arms crossed, a steely determination in her gaze. "How do we get to the heart of it without being caught?" Emma hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she considered the options. "There's only one way. We infiltrate one of his lower-tier operations first. Get in, make some noise, and draw his attention away from the safe house. It's risky, but it's the only way we stand a chance." Jack stepped forward, the weight of their mission pressing against his chest. "How do we infiltrate one of these operations? You said they're heavily guarded. We're not going to get in without being noticed." "You won't," Emma replied, her voice soft but firm. "Not unless you have someone on the inside. Someone who's already trusted. I can get you into one of his supply chains, but you'll need to find the right person who can clear the way for you inside. Once you're in, you can plant the right evidence, make Masters think you're a part of the network. He'll take the bait." Jack felt a twinge of frustration. The plan sounded like it could work, but the idea of putting themselves in such immediate danger made him uneasy. "And who exactly is going to play the part of infiltrator?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. "The risk would fall on them." "I'll go," Caroline said suddenly, her voice unwavering. "I've worked undercover before. I can blend in." Jack turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're not serious." "Caroline, we can't just walk into one of his operations and hope for the best. These people don't hesitate to kill when they feel threatened." Caroline's gaze never wavered. "I don't hesitate either. I've done this before, Jack. I'll be fine. The real question is whether or not you trust me to do it." He hesitated, the weight of the decision threatening to crush him. He had never doubted Caroline's abilities, but this was a different beast altogether. This wasn't just an undercover job, this was life and death. Finally, he nodded. "I trust you. Just, be careful." Emma, who had been silently watching them, gave a sharp nod. "We don't have time for doubts. We're doing this tonight. You'll go in, get the intel we need, and draw their attention. Once we're clear, I'll make sure you get access to the safe house." Jack could feel the tension building. There was no turning back now. They were moving forward with a plan that was dangerous at its core, one that could either bring down Masters or get them all killed. The hours seemed to stretch on as they prepared. Emma handed them several pieces of equipment, disguises, encrypted phones, and tracking devices, each one more vital than the last. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and Jack's thoughts raced, swirling with every possibility of what could go wrong. "You ready?" Caroline asked, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the tension she was feeling. Jack looked at her, his chest tight. "As ready as we'll ever be." They left the apartment with a final glance toward Emma, who stood at the door watching them, her expression unreadable. The night air hit them like a slap in the face, sharp and cold. It felt wrong to be out here, like they were in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But there was no turning back. The car ride to the operation site was a blur. Jack kept replaying the plan in his mind, mentally running through every move they would make. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Masters had an iron grip on everything. One slip-up, and it would all be over. Sinclair was driving again, the street speeding by in a rhythmic blur. The tension inside the car was thick, each of them lost in their thoughts, each of them preparing for what was to come. Emma's plan had given them a shot, but how long would it last? They couldn't afford to hesitate when the time came. They finally pulled up in front of an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The area was deserted, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic. A single guard stood by the entrance, his figure barely visible in the low light. Jack could feel his heart hammering in his chest. They were moments away from stepping into the belly of the beast, and everything they had worked for depended on the next few minutes. "Time to move," Caroline said, her voice low and steady. With one final glance between them, they all exited the car. Caroline gave Jack a quick nod before heading toward the entrance, her body language blending into the shadows, an invisible presence in the night. Jack and Laura stood back, waiting for the signal. The seconds stretched, each one feeling like an eternity. But then, they saw it, a subtle motion, a glance that passed between Caroline and the guard. She had made contact. It was happening. "Go," Jack whispered, his voice thick with urgency. They moved swiftly, slipping into the shadows, the world around them a haze of tension and anticipation. Jack's senses were heightened, every small sound amplified in the silence of the night. Caroline's safety was now the most important thing on his mind, every moment felt like a gamble. They slipped into the building, unseen by anyone, the plan in motion. But as they crossed the threshold, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something else was waiting for them inside, something darker than they had expected. And before they knew it, they were fully inside the lion's den. The dim interior of the warehouse was cold, filled with the sharp scent of rust and oil. Jack's boots echoed against the concrete floor, their sound amplified by the oppressive silence. It was almost too quiet. The shadows stretched long and the space felt as if it was holding its breath. Every step deeper into the building felt like stepping into the jaws of a beast that was patiently waiting for its prey to make a fatal mistake. Caroline, ahead of them, moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. She was like a ghost in the darkness, her figure blending seamlessly into the shadows as she approached the first checkpoint. The guards didn't seem to notice her yet, but Jack knew that wouldn't last long. They had only a few minutes before the operations clock ran out. Laura was by his side, her eyes scanning their surroundings with the kind of sharpness that only came from years of experience in high-stakes situations. Her posture was taut, as if every muscle was coiled, waiting to spring into action. Jack didn't have to say a word, they both understood the gravity of the moment. Every second that passed increased the risk. If they didn't move fast enough, if they weren't careful, it would all come crashing down. He glanced at his watch. 3 minutes had passed since Caroline had gone ahead. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the anxiety growing with every tick of the second hand. This was it. The moment where they either succeeded or everything fell apart. Suddenly, a signal, a single, sharp click of a flashlight, pierced the air. Jack's eyes snapped toward the source of the sound. It was Caroline, hidden in the shadows at the far end of the room. She was waiting for the signal to proceed. Jack nodded to Laura, and they moved swiftly toward her, careful to avoid the few guards patrolling the warehouse. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the low hum of machinery, but Jack's senses were heightened. He was on edge. The air felt thick with danger, like a storm was about to break. They reached Caroline just as she made her way toward a narrow staircase leading up to a second-floor observation deck. She turned to them, a tight-lipped smile crossing her face. "We're in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to hurry. This place is rigged with cameras, and if we're caught on film, we're done for. No way to make it out without being noticed." Jack's eyes met hers, a silent understanding passing between them. They were in this together, no matter the cost. As they ascended the stairs, Jack's mind raced. They were so close now. The safe house was within reach, but so was the deadly web that Masters had woven. They had to reach the vault, download the data, and get out without leaving a trace. The second-floor observation room was dimly lit, with rows of monitors lining the walls. On each screen, Jack could see the sprawling map of operations, the web of influence Masters had built. It was vast. And it was all within his grasp. But the question was, would they survive long enough to get what they came for? Caroline quickly hacked into the first terminal, her fingers flying over the keys. The screen flickered, then came alive with a map of various operations. Smuggling routes, illegal transactions, covert meetings. It was all there, a treasure trove of intelligence that could finally bring Masters down. "We need a minute," Caroline muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Once I download this, we're going to have every dirty secret in this place. But we'll be on a timer. They'll know we're here soon enough." Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he glanced at the door behind them. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the distance. They were running out of time. Suddenly, a sharp beep broke through the air. Caroline's fingers froze mid-typing. "We've been compromised," she said with a look of alarm. "They've locked down the system. We've got seconds before the whole place goes into lockdown mode." Jack's heart raced. "What now?" "We go, now." Caroline shot back, her voice urgent as she pulled the download drive from the terminal. "We need to get to the back exit. Now." Without hesitation, they sprinted toward the back of the room, but as they did, the sound of heavy footsteps drew closer. The guards were coming, and they were closer than ever. They burst through a side door, racing through a narrow corridor that led to a loading dock. The cold wind hit their faces as they emerged outside, but it was also their only escape route. They had no backup, no way to communicate with Emma or Sinclair. It was up to them now to make it out alive. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past Jack, grazing his arm and sending a shock of pain through his body. He spun around, just in time to see one of Masters' men emerging from the shadows, his gun trained on them. "Go!" Jack yelled to Caroline and Laura, pushing them forward as he reached for his own weapon. But before he could draw it, another figure appeared behind the guard. A sharp, calculated movement, and the man dropped to the ground, unconscious. "Emma! Get moving!" she shouted, her voice hoarse with urgency. "The exit's this way." They didn't hesitate. They followed Emma, weaving through the maze of alleyways and back streets, each one more desolate than the last. But Jack didn't feel the relief he expected. He knew they were far from safe. The moment they crossed into the open, they would be exposed. Masters wouldn't let them escape that easily. The echo of approaching sirens grew louder as they turned a corner. Police? No. Reinforcements. Masters' men were closing in, and they needed to move faster. Jack could feel the adrenaline flooding his veins, pushing him forward despite the pain from the bullet wound. The group ran, faster now, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. It was a race against time. They reached the car just as the first of the reinforcements rounded the corner. Sinclair slammed the door open, his eyes wide with fear. "Get in," he shouted. The door slammed shut behind them as the car sped off, tires screeching as they left the chaos behind. But Jack's mind was still on the download. On the information they had secured. They had the proof, now it was only a matter of getting it into the right hands. And if Masters had any idea what they were up to, he would stop at nothing to make sure that didn't happen. The night had turned into a game of cat and mouse, and the mouse had just grabbed the cheese. But the cat was closing in. As the city lights blurred past, Jack glanced at his team, Caroline, Laura, Emma, and knew one thing for sure: the real battle was just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?